Welcome back to the Free Code Camp podcast. I'm Quincy Larson, teacher and founder of freeCodeCamp.org. Each week, I'm bringing you insight from developers, entrepreneurs, and ambitious people who are getting into tech. This week, we're talking with Jessica Wilkins. She's an orchestral musician turned small business owner turned software developer. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Well, hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's such a thrill to have you here because you're one of the people that makes Free Code Camp possible. You've been doing curriculum development, and before that, you've been doing a lot of tutorials that you've created around programming and database technology, like all these different tools that developers use. Maybe you could start by just talking a little bit about what you do at Free Code Camp and what excites you about it.
Yeah, my journey with freeCodeCamp started back in 2020 as a learner, just going through the certifications, and then I started writing articles, mainly about my journey and about beginner like HTML and CSS and JavaScript concepts, and then I started writing a little bit more, and I've written tons of articles on like Python and SQL, and then recently I've been working on the JavaScript curriculum. We just released a major update, and so now it's a whole project-based curriculum, over 21 projects that you can go through and learn JavaScript. And so we're really happy about that because that's been a long time in the making. And so now we're in the beta phase. And so we're taking feedback from people going through the JavaScript curriculum and incorporating that feedback and updating it, which is one of the great things that I love about Free Code Camp is that people feel like their voices are heard. It's an open source project. And so if you feel like there's an issue or improvements, we will actually incorporate that feedback. We won't just be like, no, that's fine. We're just going to keep it as is. Like, we're very receptive to different feedback that learners have because it's for the community there. We're going to help build it out and make it even better. So that's what I've been doing in the recent days is just combing through forum posts and Discord and seeing what people have to say as they're going through the projects and just kind of helping people out. So you'll probably see me a lot on the forum and you're like, is she just like live on that forum? And I promise I do like sleep occasionally there. I do sleep and stuff like that. But it does seem like I'm always on the forum, just like answering questions and just helping people out wherever I can. But that's mainly what I've been working on the past few months is the JavaScript curriculum there.
Yeah, and you were a prolific forum contributor. You were like super active on the forum way back in like 2020, 2021, like a long time ago. That was where I kind of discovered like, who is this woman and why is she so helpful? Like what compels her to go out and help so many people in the community? And maybe you could talk about your transition into tech and like how you ended up on the Free Code Camp forum. And maybe we can go back even farther and you could talk a little bit about just growing up and your early childhood out there in California. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Jessica's joining us from sunny Los Angeles.
Yeah, I'm actually happy because it was raining last week and it wasn't so sunny, and I was like, this is not what I signed up for. Like I signed up for typical
in California.
Exactly. So I was like, what is this? Like, come on. And so I'm happy it's actually like sunny outside, but yeah, so my early life there, so I was actually born in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I was adopted at birth by my mom, and so she was a single mom, and she wanted children and wasn't married, so she went down the adoption route, and so basically I was raised by my mom and my grandmother, and occasionally my uncle would help out as well, and so they adopted me from Las Vegas. She had a friend that was living out there, and so she stayed with her because I guess the adoption process, like it's like weeks, it's like months on end, but then once things like get rolling and she's been approved, then it still took, I think she spent like 6 weeks or 7 weeks before I was born, just staying in Las Vegas over the summer because she was a teacher, and so she had summers off, and so she stayed with her friend, and then I was born, and then they had to do last minute things before she could actually take me home. And so it's like this long, complicated process, which I guess is a good thing. Like, I guess it needs to be that way because you got to check everybody out and all that. But yeah, and so we finally went home, and we actually spent the first few years in Los Angeles living with my grandmother. And so my grandmother had a duplex, and so my grandmother lived on the first floor, and then we lived on the second floor there. And so the first 6 years of my life, I lived in Los Angeles, and went to school out here, all the way up until about like first grade. And then my mom had a job offer in Palm Springs, and she already had a condo out in Palm Springs. She would visit occasionally. And so once she got the job offer, she picked up and moved and started teaching out in Palm Springs. And I spent the rest of my childhood out in Palm Springs, which for those of you who aren't familiar with Palm Springs, now it's like completely different. The last time I was there was like a couple of years ago. They're trying to make it this like tourist destination. If you're familiar with like Coachella Festival, where all the like music stars and stuff like that hang out. And so they're trying to bring more festivals, and they're trying to bring more events and a younger crowd. But when I was growing up, it was definitely an older crowd, and it was where a lot of retirees would go, and they would have like second or third homes there. So it was a very different landscape than what it is now. But it's a very quiet town. It's a small town. It's about 2 hours south of Los Angeles. And so it was a nice little town to kind of grow up in. Nice, close-knit family and community there. And so you got to know people pretty well. But I started learning, I started getting into music at 7 because my grandmother had this old piano that like my mom actually used to play on. It's a Wurlitzer, and we still have it.
Wow. Wurlitzer.
Yeah.
Piano. So
it's like a regular piano. It's like, I think the brand is called Wurlitzer. I don't know if they still even make this type of piano, but it's like a really old piano.
When I think of Wurlitzer, I think of like the electric piano, like the Rhodes style.
Right,
it's a Rhodes piano, but with bite.
right, yeah.
But you actually had like I guess before they made the iconic electric piano, they made, or technically electromechanical piano. They made just traditional, like, it was just like an upright or something like that.
Yeah. So it's like a small little piano, which we still have to this day. It's now with me, but like my grandmother had it, and then my mom took piano lessons for like a few months, and then got bored with it, and then my grandmother just held on to it all these years. And so by the time I came along, I was always just kind of intrigued by the piano and just playing around on it. And my grandma was like, oh, she really takes to that. Maybe we should get her some lessons. And my mom's like, okay, cool. And so we were moving to Palm Springs. She's like, do you want to just take the piano with you? And she's like, yeah, sure, I guess. And so we had moved from the condo to the house there. And so she signed me up for piano lessons. And that was kind of the beginning of my musical journey, was playing piano. So I have like weekly piano lessons for like 30 minutes with this really nice woman named Vicky, and I would go over to her house, and she would have the little piano book on the stand and give me homework. And then I remember at the end, she would always have like this table full of candy and these like small little toys that you probably get at like the dollar store. And so when you did a good job, you could take a piece of candy and like a little toy with you. And I was like, that's so cool. So yeah, it was pretty awesome.
Hey, this is Quincy from the future. Just a quick note that during this podcast, we spend the first hour talking about Los Angeles music industry and how Jessica was able to gradually climb the ranks and start getting jobs with orchestras and with big companies like Disney. If you don't care that much about music and you just want to jump straight to the software development part, we have a link in the video description / podcast show notes that you can click to jump straight there. Cheers. So how long were you doing piano lessons before you got into your I guess main instrument, which is of course the oboe?
Yeah, so I studied piano from 7, and I officially, I guess, stopped around 17, but I started the oboe at 11. And so in California, they have a lot of elementary music programs. They're kind of scattered about, and different states are a little more hardcore into their music education. Like the state you're in is a way more hardcore, generally speaking, into its music education. And then California, it's kind of just varies between area to area. And so I was fortunate enough that they did actually have an elementary music program. And so 4th grade, so I was 9 years old at this point, they taught us recorders. We'd have like a weekly class. And then 5th grade, we had a little 5th grade band. And so we would have weekly classes, and we only got to pick like 5 instruments. And it was like flute, clarinet, saxophone, trumpet, I think trombone was one of them, and then percussion. But percussion, quote unquote, was like, here's a drum pad. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to teach you timpani. It's like, no, you're 10. We're going to teach you like, drum pad and give you a pair of sticks. Yeah. And then maybe stick one kid on like bass drum or something. And so I picked trumpet and I hated it. I was like really bad at it. I didn't take any trumpet lessons outside of the class and I just didn't really like it, but I stuck with it for the whole year. And when it came time to leave elementary school and go into middle school, I still wanted to play, music and be with my friends. But I was like, I am not sticking with this trumpet thing. I sound terrible. I hate it. And so what am I supposed to play? Because I was still playing piano, but like you can't play piano in band with the exception of like jazz band. And so I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? And so my mom had taught at the middle school that I was about to go to. And she's like, well, I'll talk to the band director and we'll see what we could do there. And so I met with him after class and he was like, okay, I hear that you're interested in joining band with us next year, but you don't know what to play yet. And he's like, maybe you'll try the oboe. And I was like, I have no clue what that is. It's not exactly like super common. And he like went and grabbed an instrument and grabbed a reed and like put it together for me and like told me basically kind of how to make at least one note on it. And he's like, okay, here's how you form your embouchure and like, here's how you blow and like just go for it. And I made some sort of sound. And he's like, great, you're our new oboe player. And I was like, okay, cool.
Wow.
So I was like, okay, sure, because I'm like 11, so
you probably went home
just
and
go
looked
with
at
the
that
flow.
oboe. I don't mean to interrupt, but you probably went home and looked at that oboe and looked at the case, and you're just like, I mean, did you feel daunted? Like you're going to be playing oboe in band, and the musical director's initiation was literally putting the oboe in your mouth and seeing if you could even make a note.
Right. Yeah, because I was just like, okay. And then apparently there was one other girl that had been playing for at least a year at that point, and so we were going to be in the same class, and we ended up being in the same grade all the way up through high school there.
Wow.
But yeah, so it was pretty much just the two of us, and so those first like few months, it was just trying to figure out how do I tame this thing, because it's just very like it can be very wild if you don't really know what you're doing, and it can be kind of loud and stuff like that. So my mom signed me up for lessons. There was this really nice woman named Lynn who had lived close by or close-ish that we can get to, and so I had weekly lessons with her, starting off with like I think it started off with 30 minutes, and then we bumped it up to like 45 minutes and an hour as I started to build up my stamina as I got older. And so it was great working with her because she was super passionate into the oboe. She was never a professional oboist. She was a early music school teacher, but she was always into the oboe and would go to festivals and stuff like that. And so it was great because that passion and interest in it like rubbed off on me, and I was like, this seems kind of cool. And so she would expose me to my first few like oboe recordings and like, oh, here are the prominent oboe people in the community. I was like, oh, that's so cool, maybe I get to meet some of them one day. And so yeah, then she started talking about like different types of music festivals I could do. And so as I started getting older and I progressed from 6th grade to 7th grade, etc., I started looking at my first few summer festivals, and that's where you spend like a couple of weeks literally just playing and performing and rehearsing all day. And so my first festivals were in Idlewild, which is about like a 45-minute drive from Palm Springs, and it's up in the mountains, and like it's not just for music, it's for all arts disciplines. But it was great just kind of being with other people and like just making music. And so I started just playing oboe, and I also picked up clarinet because I wanted to be in the marching band, but I never really put that much interest into clarinet. Yeah. So I got like good enough to kind of just like coast along. And so I didn't really put that much time into it. I could have like gotten a little bit better with clarinet, but with oboe I really took to it, and by the time I was 15 I was like, I want to be a professional oboist. Like that's what I want to do.
Wow.
So I started getting really
you made up your mind pretty early on, like
yeah
you specialized. And I'm curious what that career path looked like, because I didn't mention this earlier, but you essentially ascended to like among the highest ranks of oboists, I guess, like on national television and stuff, playing the oboe. And I'm curious what that progression looks like for getting into, I guess, the orchestral industry. So 15, you make up your mind. I'm going to be an oboist. Which I think when I was 15, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do with my life. I was really into writing, but that was about it.
Yeah, I just like really took to it. And I think at 15, you're like trying to just figure things out. And then, of course, like guidance counselors are talking to you like, what are you going to do for college? I'm like, I don't know. And like, I was never like super, super awesome in school. Like, I did like fine with classes, and I was always like super ambitious where I would try to take extra classes like AP classes, which are advanced placement classes in the States there. But I was never like super into like hard sciences or math and stuff. I was always into music, and so that seemed like the logical career choice. And so at that point I had switched from learning with Lynn. I started studying with a professional oboist named Fred, and he kind of took me to a whole new level and exposed me to so much more and started telling me about what it's actually like to be a professional oboist. And that was so valuable to me because he just opened up this whole other world, and he really was the one to kind of introduce me to like, okay, kid, here's how this really works. And so if you're interested in becoming a professional musician within the orchestral or opera space, typically you do have to start as young as like 10 or 11, or in some of these areas as young as like 4 or 5 or 6 or something like that.
If you don't mind me asking, like you said, building up the stamina, I guess, to play the oboe, it takes physical stamina, whereas playing the piano, like, I mean, you could probably play the piano all day with a little bit of practice because you're just making movements with your hands and stuff, but you're not actually using your lungs. And like, I don't know, why is it that you have to start so young if you want to really reach the upper echelons of classical music?
Yeah, I think the short answer is unfortunately just the competition and the standard that is set. Like, because when you go into an orchestral audition, the basic process is that most people have been playing for like 10 to 12 years, so that's usually who you're going up against. And not everybody's invited to the in-person audition, so sometimes they'll have what's called a pre-screening round. Sometimes they'll filter you out based on school, which isn't always great because there's great players everywhere, but sometimes they are that selective. I've been in situations where they will only go to certain schools and hold auditions. So it's unfortunate that they're kind of gatekeepy like that, but it does happen. And so if you do like get to an interview, then there's this whole list, like 30 to 40 orchestral excerpts that you just have to know perfectly. And if you make a mistake, you're out. And so they're like looking for you to make a mistake because they're inviting like 60, 70, 80 people to this audition. And that first round, they're just getting rid of most of you. And so if you make a mistake, you make their lives easier because it's like, oh, okay, cool. We just got rid of another person. And so you go through like multiple rounds of auditions, and it's that competitive. And my teacher used to always tell me like, you should be able to wake up in the middle of the night and I should be able to say, all right, play this piece, play this, and you should play it perfectly out of the dead of sleep, and that's how you know know it. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm
trying to think about like even the simple bass lines I play. Like if somebody stood me up and said play this bass line without any mistakes, cold, like that would be extremely difficult for me. And of course, I picked up the bass at like age 40 or something. Like I played it when I was a kid, a little bit in bands and stuff, but I wasn't serious about it. But I'm just trying to like understand the level that you need to be able to perform at, and like the psychological hurdles and all that practice that goes into being in front of the judges and basically getting zero leeway. Like what you said, they're actually hoping that you fail because that makes their job easier, so they don't have to make hard decisions between a whole bunch of perfect performances or something like that, or near perfect performances. And also just thinking about, like you said, 80 or 90 kids that are trying to get into essentially advance up the ranks within this system, and it's very much like kind of a tournament system, like what we call a tournament in economic models and stuff, where like many will enter, few will win. And it's not that like people win it to varying degrees. Like software engineering, like there are 30 million developers in the world. Some of them are junior devs. Some of them are, individual contributors. Like some of them are senior devs. And then some go on to be CTO or head of engineering, or just to create their own prominent open source project or create their own tool or something like that, or found a company, like any number of different things you can do. And yet in oboe land, it seems like if you don't like perform at a certain level, like how many shots on goal do you get? You know, as a kid trying to climb up. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Like, you were obviously able to jump through the hoops and get to the higher echelons, if I'm using the correct terms. But there were probably a lot of people who worked really hard who didn't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just like it's really crazy competitive. And like when you're like a kid, when you're like middle school or high school age, like young, teenage age, then you start doing like honor band auditions. That's where everybody within the district, or sometimes you'll do like honor like state band, and that's like everybody in the state. And California's a pretty big state, so that's a pretty tough competition there.
30 million
and
people.
So you start. Yeah. So you start like doing stuff like that, and you get a taste early on about competition, and so you see all these. And usually they put you in like at least for the middle school, high school level, it's a little bit different when you're going for college. But when you're at the middle school, high school level, and you're auditioning for like state orchestra or state band there, then they'll put you all in one room, and so you literally are in your room, like this loud room with everybody. So talk about like psychological mind games where you're hearing everybody that plays your same instrument, and they're playing the exact same audition material. You're like, okay, don't psych yourself out. You just do your own thing, but you're hearing literally your competition in one room. And exactly. So you got to have like nerves of steel. And so you go through that process a few times, and you kind of learn how to deal with that early on. And that kind of helps prepare you for the college auditions that you end up going on. And it's not, the college auditions a little bit different, where you don't have to have those large rooms. Usually they're smaller rooms, but you're still in a room with other people that you're competing with. So it's still intimidating because, especially for oboe, a lot of these studios will only, like, they'll have, at least with oboe, it's usually for college, maybe 30 to 40 or 50, depending on the school and the popularity and stuff like that. But most oboe studios are a little bit smaller, so they're probably accepting like 2 people. So if like 40 people show up, then like 2 people get in. They're not going to accept like 20 people in their oboe studio all at once. And so for my situation, I had applied to, I think it was a total, what was it? I think 5 schools or 6 schools. Somewhere around 5 or 6 schools, somewhere around there, and all across the country. I didn't apply anywhere outside of the states there, and so I applied for all the big, or some of the bigger schools like Eastman School of Music, Northwestern, and then some of the smaller schools like University of Las Vegas. And I learned pretty quickly that, like, to get an edge, you have to take a lesson with the teacher beforehand to, like, develop a relationship with them. And then the following year, you come back and audition for them. Yeah. So, like, you have to, like, learn that stuff, or just know that stuff, or someone has to, like, tell you that stuff. And so if you don't know that going in, unfortunately, you might be at a disadvantage, because somebody that's taken lessons or has gone to their music festival might have a better rapport with them, and then you're just going in cold. I mean, you can still, win out and get into their studio, but you might be at a disadvantage because someone else has already been working with them, and they kind of have a little bit of leg up. So there's a lot of that going on too, where you just have to, like, know stuff, or like know people who know stuff that will tell you that. So it's an interesting kind of world that goes on there.
So it's not enough to play perfectly. To some extent, there will be other people who perform the piece. Yeah, and perfect, of course, is like, I don't mean exactly perfectly. There are always going to be extremely minor variations between performance at a high level, I would imagine. But to some extent, it is who you know, and like your relationships that you've established with them, and probably a whole lot of other considerations on top of being really good at oboe. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And so it sometimes kind of favors, because oboe is not a cheap instrument. And so if you're listening to this and you have kids and you're like, I want to start my kid on the oboe, like, that's great, but there is a financial component to that. So unfortunately, it does, like, favor those that are in a different socioeconomic, whether you're middle class or higher, to afford the lessons, the reads, the maintenance. And so it differs from other instruments, unfortunately. So you have to be prepared for that as well. $
1,700 is what this orchestral place website that came up in Google is saying just for a starter, and then if you want like a professional oboe, it's like $6,000 or more.
Oh, for sure.
You know, how frequently do you have to replace the reeds?
So reeds, like I would usually go through reeds. I would probably go through like 6 or like when I was a kid, 6 or 7 like a week. And then as a professional, since I was making them at that point, that I would go through them quicker. And so sometimes you play literally just a concert on a reed and it's like, okay, that's done. And so, because it's like 2 pieces of cane like tied together. And so they don't really like last forever. And it's not like it disintegrates or anything. It's just like, it doesn't have like that same, you know, you want a reed that you can really go for it. So if you're doing like a heavy intensive concert, that reed's it's gonna take it.
Yeah.
There,
I mean, to contrast that, like you know, you made your own reeds?
I started in high school, and then by the time I got into college, it was pretty much a requirement that we were making our own reeds. And a lot of us were still beginner reed makers. We were not really professionals, or very few of us were actually professionals like at that stage. But yeah, it was a requirement that we had to make our own there.
Yeah, that's such an interesting, like the Spartans having to weave their own mat that they're going to lie on. You know, it's just kind of one of those rites of passages, I guess, making your own reeds. Yeah, I mean, just to compare and contrast, like $6,000 for a starter instrument. Like I play on this Fender precision bass, P bass, and I think I spent like $600, and I spent like $15 on flat wound strings, and you never change them, and that's like all the gear you need. Like I just plug into this little bass cube that I paid $300 for, so less than $1,000. I have basically the top. Like tons of musicians play on the P bass, Sting, Jamerson, like all the not all of them, but a lot of bass players just use this gear, and it's so inexpensive, and it costs basically nothing to maintain. And I compare that to like the amount of maintenance you're probably having to do on an oboe, and then and it sounds like a big hurdle for a family with a lot of kids. Like you come home from school, you're like, hey, can I play oboe? It sounds like because your grandma was already really into music, that your family was pretty receptive to that, and they were willing to encourage you and provide lessons and stuff like that. So, thank goodness they did, because you've built an entire career out of that, a first career. And I'd be very interested in talking about like more about oboe and your progression in there, but I do want to get to your sheet music business. Maybe you could taper in that direction as you talk about like your progress as a musician.
Yeah. So at this point, I was 17 years old, applying for colleges, and there was one school I really wanted to go to, which is Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, because every single person I talked to had one thing to say. They were like, Richard Kilmer, he's amazing. If you get to study with him, like, you are just golden, and all of his students I've worked with. And so every single person I talked to kept mentioning his name. And I was like, who is this guy? And so I looked him up, and I was like, wow, this guy's pretty cool. And so I just wanted to meet him, and I was hoping to get a lesson with him. But Rochester is obviously far away from Palm Springs,
Rochester,
California. Rochester, New York. Yeah.
This is like a 6,000 or 7,000 miles. This is basically as far as 2 points could be and still be in the continental U.S.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I unfortunately was never able to get a lesson, and I was bummed because everybody said like, oh, you're not going to get in if you don't get if you're going to have to like go out there and audition in person. And so I was talking with my mom, and she was looking at all these schools. She's like, look, we got to be practical. I don't know if I can we could get to these East Coast schools, because I had also applied for Northwestern, and so she was just looking at the practicality. She's like, I don't think we could swing this. Is there any way you could do auditions like regionally? And luckily they did have a few regional auditions for both Northwestern and Eastman, and so they had them both in Los Angeles, which was great. That's obviously much closer, and my grandmother was out there, and so we could just stay with her. And they had them, I believe it was both one was at Walt Disney's Concert Center, Walt Disney Hall in downtown LA, and then the other was at Colburn, which is right next to it.
Place, by the way. I've been there. Yeah. It's amazing.
It's really
in Los
nice.
Angeles. There are a lot of really famous. What are they called? Like basically spaces where music is played.
So it's a nice little area around there.
Yeah. What's the word for that? The actual,
so there's the concert halls and there's a few recital halls around there. Yeah, that whole like block right there is just really nice. And they've been building it out recently, but yeah, that whole block right there. And so that's where I had a couple of my auditions, and they were regional auditions. And so for the regional ones, the teachers that I was auditioning for actually weren't there. They sent out people from admissions, and they had a video camera, and they set up a video camera, and they were like, okay, go through your audition pieces. And at the college level, there's a little more leeway. You can still make mistakes to a point because you're still kind of a kid, but then you get to the professional level, it's like, no, that's not going to happen. So there was still luckily some leeway and forgiveness because you're still kind of considered an amateur at that point. And so my audition for Eastman like started off well, but then I started making mistakes, and then I felt really bad after it. I was like, oh, I blew my shot and I didn't even get to meet him. So I was just convinced that I wasn't going to make it. And I was really surprised when I got the phone call in after school math tutoring that I like actually got in. I was like, wait, what? Did they call the right person? Is this like, I had to like replay the message, and it was someone from admissions. They're like, hey, I just wanted to congratulate you on getting into Eastman. I was like, whoa, okay.
Yeah, wow.
That's so cool.
Maybe what you performed before you started making mistakes was so well done that they thought that maybe it's just nerves or something like that. That's great. Congratulations on getting into Eastman, a school which I frankly don't know a whole lot about. I know about like UNT, and I know about like Berkeley, some of the more I guess like mainstream, like well-known music schools. But Eastman. So what does that mean? Does that mean you move out there to Rochester?
So then the next question was, well, the cost, tuition, and moving out to Rochester. And so and at that point, it was crazy how like life works out, where I had gotten an acceptance into UNLV, which is University of Las Vegas.
Northern Las Vegas.
Yeah. And then I got like rejections from USC, Northwestern, like it was like also Arizona State. So it was just like rejection after rejection. I'm like, okay, well, it doesn't look like anything else is going to work out there.
Note, I just want to correct myself. First of all, I said the population of California was 30 million. It's 39 million. And UNLV does not stand for University of Northern Las Vegas, University of Nevada at Las Vegas.
Oh, okay,
Sorry.
Las Vegas.
I just don't want people to walk around with bad information. And by the way, I said earlier, UNT, that stands for University of North Texas. It's pretty close to where I live here in Plano. Sorry, please continue. I hope that didn't derail you. I don't want to be, putting misinformation out there and have somebody confidently say, oh, and like quote me and be wrong. So please continue.
No worries. Yeah. And so, I kept receiving rejection after rejection after rejection. I was like, okay, well, I'm clearly not going to get into like Eastman because I had received 3 rejections in a row. And so at that point I thought, okay, I'm going to University of Las Vegas. And that's obviously closer by to where we were at. So I was already mentally getting in the mindset, and I had really liked the teacher and the studio. And so I was like, okay, this could be cool there. And then when I got the call, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, cool. I actually like got in. And then it became a question of like, how do we pay for this? Because Eastman's not exactly cheap. I have no clue what they charge now, but it's not exactly cheap there. And Eastman's part of the University of Rochester. And so Eastman is just the music school there. But since I clearly wasn't in state, I didn't get any, in-state, discounts or anything like that. And so I was fortunate enough to get some scholarships. And so that helped out a lot. And then my mom helped out a lot. And then I did take out some student loans. But thankfully it wasn't too many, because that could have been way worse if I didn't get like scholarships and if my mom hadn't helped out, especially with like the dorms and stuff like that. So we were able to make it work once the scholarship money came in, and I was like, all right, I guess we're moving to Rochester, New York.
I can imagine. I mean, it's a typical kind of private research institution, $46,000 per year that's tuition and fees. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of freaking money. It's like approaching what, like a median income for like a household or something in America. So
right. Yeah.
I can imagine that the scholarships were probably a big help there. So you were able to convince your family, like, this isn't crazy, we can make this work. So maybe you can walk us through what it was like to arrive in a polar opposite part of the United States and at this pretty competitive, institution that is going to have you going really deep on music and especially on oboe. Because what was your major? Were you like musical composition, musical performance?
Yeah, music performance. Yeah.
Okay.
And so music performance and oboe specialty there. And my mom, people kept asking me like, oh, are you going to do music education? But my mom always told me like, don't go into public school education unless you like really, really want to. Because I think a lot of that came from like, she felt like she just kind of had to. And she came from a different period. So probably part of that was true. There weren't a lot of options.
I mean, maybe as a woman, I would imagine like in terms of careers, there were kind of the accepted career paths that women went into, and teacher was one that, I mean, to this day, like I'm thinking about the school that my kids go to, I think virtually every person that's teaching there is a woman. I think there might be one or two male teachers on the entire staff. So that was kind of presumptive for me to just jump to, her being a woman in the 1970s, 1980s as the reason why she went into education and not into a field like software engineering. But maybe you could elaborate a little on it.
Yeah, I think that she definitely came from a different generation where there weren't a whole, like, it was an interesting landscape and change for women going into the workforce and what kind of available jobs that they did have. And I think at the time teaching was one of the, quote unquote acceptable jobs or jobs that were more available. And so you start looking at tech, and tech was obviously in a very different landscape in the 70s and 80s than it was obviously today, especially with, the internet. And I think if she was just born, maybe if she were a millennial and born in a different generation, I think she would be really good as a programmer because she has degrees in math and always enjoyed math and science, and it does actually like computers. But I think that just was never an option for her, and I don't even know what kind of computer science programs looked like back then. And so that just wasn't a thing. But I think if she was just born in a different generation and was encouraged to program, she would actually be a really good programmer, and I could see her doing really well and crafting a really good career for herself. And she would probably work maybe in like the back end. I don't know if she would really enjoy like the front end space, but I could see her really enjoying like the back end space and doing really well in that. But she was just born at a different time, and options were kind of different. Like she had a very interesting career where she was actually a flight attendant for a while during like the TWA Pan Am era, so none of those companies exist anymore, but it was a very different time, and like flight attendants, that was a pretty good career back then. And so she worked as a flight attendant, she sold textbooks for a while, and then she kind of bounced back and forth between teaching and finally landed on teaching towards the end of her 20s there. So she kind of like, I don't want to say she hated teaching. She loved the students, but like it wasn't her career choice. She just kind of, that was something that she did, and she did it for like 30 plus years. And so she always told me like, don't go it, like if you want to get a music education degree, like get it because you want to and you want to become a band director. And so I decided to just stick with music performance. And when we flew out there, so this is now summer of 2009, I graduated from high school, came back from a major trip, and because my high school band took like all these crazy trips everywhere, and so we came back from the trip, and then we was like, okay, we got to pack and go to Rochester. And so we flew out there. We had a couple of suitcases, and that was pretty much of course my oboe. And we got there, and that's when we started the orientation. And so I started meeting people, and my roommate didn't show up until I think like the next day, because she was coming from China. She was coming from Beijing. She was a pianist, and so I just had the room to myself that first day, just as I got like acclimated. But that whole day was kind of a whirlwind, because of course you go through like all of these like orientation and all these meetings and all of your tried to do these like tours of the campus, because I had never seen the campus in person. So I was like, oh, This is what it looks like.
I mean, that's pretty wild, pulling the trigger on like that kind of like decision without ever visiting the campus. But it's a lot of resources to fly out to New York just to see the campus that you've already kind of made up your mind that you're going to attend, right?
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, we weren't able to like get out there and do a trip beforehand. We weren't able to audition out there, so that was like the first time I had ever stepped foot into Rochester and seeing Eastman for the first time. And it's this like grand building, and they were still working on they were updating the Eastman Theater, so I wasn't able to even go in there until they were finished. But then it was really cool, just soaking it all in, and they throw so much information your way, so I didn't remember half of what they told me, because you go through all these orientation and meetings and safety meetings and all of this other stuff, and then I got checked in with the dorms, and we put our stuff away, and my mom was being a typical mom of like folding up my clothes and putting them in the drawers and stuff like that, and then we had a quick meal together, and then we got back to the dorms, and she said, okay, well, I'm gonna go back to the hotel, and then I'm gonna fly out tomorrow. I was like, okay. I was like,
wow.
Okay.
I mean, you'd lived with your mom, like obviously you went out to the mountains for these like musical retreats and stuff like that, so you'd spend some time away from her. But had you ever done anything on that order of like just being apart from her for an entire semester or however long you were away?
Yeah, this was like the first time I would have been away from her for like months and months on end. And so it was like an awkward goodbye. And I was like, okay, I'll see you later. It's not like she was going to be down the street where I could just like drive. Because some of my friends, they could drive down for the weekend to go visit. And like that wasn't really, like I didn't even go down for Thanksgiving because it was just too quick of a turnaround. And so I only visited during Christmas and then, of course, the summers when I came back. So it would be months on end without like seeing her in person. So it was kind of crazy when she like left, and it was just me, and I had to start making some friends there. And so slowly but surely started meeting some other people from the oboe studio, and then I finally met the man himself, Richard Kilmer, who's the oboe professor and still is the oboe professor to this day, well into his like late 80s, but he's still teaching there. And so I got to meet him, and he was so happy. I had talked to him on the phone before I got there, and we talked for like an hour, and he just went through everything I was going to basically do that first year. And he was so excited and happy. And he was telling me about the other oboists that were going to be there. And he's just that type of person. And so when he met me, he's like, oh, you're Jessica. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. And we're going to this is going to be a great 4 years for you. And I was like, this is cool. Okay. Like I wasn't expecting that. But he's just like that type of guy. He loves the oboe. He loves to teach. He's just like happy about life. And so I was really excited. And he's like, oh, have you met the other oboists there? And let me introduce you to so-and-so. And so he was like introducing me to all of these people and just giving me the lowdown. And then we had like a studio dinner. I think most of the oboe studio was there. That was about like 18 or so people, which is actually larger. That's a larger studio than most. Most studios are around like 7 to 10. But just because of his reputation and whatnot, he was able to build out a larger studio. But most studios are typically around 7 to 10 people. So 18 people is kind of a lot.
Very low student to teacher ratio in a sense. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, how many hours a week were you did you have one-on-one, or was it seminar? How were you learning with
So the way that so the way it's structured for all the music performance majors is that you do have weekly lessons. It's for an hour, and then you have what is called studio class, and so that's where the entire studio meets, and then you just talk about the different pedagogy. You do what are called mock auditions, where you just go through a pretend audition, and your teacher grades you and gives you feedback, and then you also get up there and you play what you've been working on, whether it's a recital piece or orchestral excerpts or whatever you're doing at that moment, and your teacher gives you feedback in front of the other students. And so it's more like a masterclass type situation, so everybody gets to learn from each other. So that first year, he always left the freshmen playing in the studio class last, and so he would have the seniors play first, or I think it was seniors, juniors, sophomores, and then freshmen, and then grad students. So each week, like, he would break it up into like these different themed classes there. And then at the end of the semester, we always did mock auditions, which were always like, those were the toughest ones because he was so strict about it, because he wanted to prepare us for the realities of a professional audition, which are very strict and have very high standards. And so he had very high standards because he was like, look, I just want to prepare you for, like, this is what you signed up for. And so like, we always joke that like studio class would always be an extra hour like longer, because we would get through the mock auditions, and basically the way that auditions work is that a lot of them are done behind a screen to keep it quote unquote more fair, and sometimes it is, and they tell women not to wear like high heels and stuff to give away that you're a woman, and so you want to keep it as neutral as possible. So you keep, like, you're supposed to wear like quiet shoes and stuff like that, and so they try to keep it as like fair and neutral to remove any type of bias, I guess as best as possible. So they have this screen in front of you between the judges and the actual performer there, and so we imitated that for the actual mock auditions. And so he told us beforehand what we were playing, and and they were all like excerpts that we were familiar with, that we've been playing for a long time. So there were no like surprises. It's not like, oh, play this random one. We're like, I've never heard that piece. So we were all like prepared. But the other side of that is like, this better be perfect, because you should be prepared. So there's no excuses. You can't just be like, I've never heard of that. And so he had like a really high standard. So we would go in one after another and just play through the excerpts, and we wouldn't say anything. And then we would just walk out and just one after another. And so like that would be for about an hour or so. And then he would spend the next hour just grilling us on like every single mistake that we made.
Wow! So he's taking notes the whole time, like your articulation is off on this particular thing, or you're supposed to play softly and you're playing slightly too loud, or I mean, I'm just kind of like guessing the type of feedback that he might be giving.
That it was that detailed. Like I remember there was one time where he started off. He was like, okay. Well, he would tell us who would move on to the next round. And so he always had expectations that everybody would move on to the next round. But then, like, if we didn't meet like the standard, then we wouldn't move on. So he wouldn't say who until you got to your private lesson. But he would say, okay, out of the like 18 of you that went through, I would have only passed 6. And I was like, oh gosh. Wow. And so I knew that he was like not happy with that, because he wanted all 18 of us. And so then he would go into this whole hour and be like, okay, in measure 1 from the D natural to F sharp, some of you, that F sharp is way too high. That was like 15 cents sharp. Like, I don't know what you guys are doing. That needs to be a true cents.
Okay, like I'm trying to think of how many hertz of a difference that is, but it's not many.
It's not many, but
like when I tune my bass, like if it's within like 5 or 10 cents, I'm like, cool, good enough.
Yeah, like he would just be like that strict. He's like, guys, this is a major I don't know why you're playing that sharp, like it's a major third. I don't know why you thought it was a good idea. And so he would just go that nitpicky, and he'd be like, yeah, and then this phrase right here, some of you are just, I don't know what you're doing phrasing it like this, it's supposed to be like this. And so he would be that detailed. And then in your private lessons, he would go into even more detail. And so no one wanted the lesson, like if you had your lesson the next day, you're like, oh gosh, okay. like because if you did badly, you were going to hear about it, and then if you did well, then it was like, okay, it's a good day. And so you never wanted to have the lesson the day after mock auditions if you could help it there. But otherwise, like he always had a high standard for us, but then you could tell he really cared about us and just wanted us to like succeed, and he knew what that world was all about there. And so we always had his support. We could always just ask him whatever, or if we needed extra help and with like chamber music and stuff like that, he was always there for us. So we were really fortunate to have that situation.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing learning experience. I mean, you're learning from a literal master of the instrument who has, at this point, 5 plus 6 decades of, performance experience. So he can come in and incredibly hold you to the highest standards because he probably holds himself to extremely high standards, and he probably, notes imperfections in his playing as well, that he's probably still working on it, I would imagine. Like, there's the term woodshedding, where people just go off into the woodshed and practice, until they're like up to their own standards, and then they go out there and they discover new standards that are even higher than their own standards, right? Having done that for decades, I can only imagine what that was like and how beneficial it was to your playing to be with somebody like that. And I'm trying to think of like programming parallels to that, maybe pair programming with, an extremely experienced developer or something like that. But it's just not part of the developer education experience, to my knowledge. Like, unless you're going to an extremely top tier engineering school, I can't imagine a situation where you would get that kind of like extremely nuanced and granular feedback. It might exist. I didn't get a computer science degree. I guess neither did you. So right. I don't know that there aren't these extremely tight seminar type courses. But I think with music performance, you could argue that it's not as subjective as code, in the sense that there are so many different ways you can implement something. But when you're looking at sheet music, I mean, could you argue that there is a one correct way to play it, and then there are more expressive ways and stuff like that? But in general, like if you're joining an orchestra, hypothetically, and we'll talk about the kind of career progression of professional musicians, but if you were going to an audition, would they value you taking creative liberties with the music, or do they want you to play it exactly as it is on the page?
Yeah, so that's the thing about like when you're studying music, you have to know when you can have certain liberties and then when you can't. And so if you're going to play something by like Mozart, you need to play it in Mozart style. So you can't just be like, adding in like, oh, I'm going to play it like a more modern 20th or 21st century style. It's like, no, it's still Mozart. And so you still have to have like that right style right there. So when you get to like when you're playing through like the Mozart concerto, there's always a cadenza, and a cadenza in movements is basically like a place where the orchestra stops playing and it's just you playing, and it's something that you have made up. And so even though you get to make it up, you still like, it's still got to be in the style of Mozart. Like you can't just like make up whatever. So there's always that fine line where it's like, yeah, you have creative liberties, and then each orchestra has its own style. And so like Chicago is going to be different from LA, which is going to be different from New York, which is going to be different from San Francisco. So you have to like do this research ahead of time to be like, okay, what is the style of this particular wind section or string section or whatever section you're hoping to join, and match their style. Because at the end of the day, even if you're a really talented performer, if they can't see you fitting in that orchestra, you're not going to get the job. And so you have to be able to like fit in with that particular sound there. I'm just like, Eddie Van Halen would not be a good soloist for a Steely Dan record, even though he's a good soloist for a Van Halen record, right? right, exactly. Yeah. So there's always that like tightrope where it's like, okay, I'm going to inject a little bit of myself, but then I'm still in an orchestra, and this is how they choose to perform there. So it's kind of a tightrope there. Yeah. Awesome. So let's talk about, okay, you've talked a little bit about how you got into music, how you got into the school, what your training was like at the school. What happens after you graduate? Like what do you do? Like, what proportion of the people at your school are likely to be able to get positions at different orchestras or different I guess bodies of musicians? Because I know that they're like jazz bands, there are probably a lot of other types of opportunity out there, but what are the career prospects like, given that you've gone through this incredibly rigorous educational process for, at this point, probably like a decade and a half? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think by the time I had graduated, at this point I was 21, so I started at 11. So I've been at like 10 years playing my instrument. And so it came time to be like, what do we do now? And so some people will keep getting degrees, and they'll get a master's, they'll get a specialist, they'll get a doctorate, they'll just keep tacking on degrees there. And some people, they have the financial resources to do that. And so for me, I really wasn't sure if I was going to stay in Rochester, if I was going to move somewhere else, if I moved to California. And so there were a couple of schools that I was interested in studying for my master's. And I told myself, if I don't get into any of these schools, then I'm just not going to do a master's. I only want to do a master's if I could do do it at these schools. So I only applied to 3 schools with that assumption. And the other thing was the financial component had to work out. And so I said if I didn't have significant scholarships, because I was on my own at that point, because my mom was like, look, I'll help you pay for undergrad, but like all the extra stuff, like you're kind of on your own, which I was like, oh, that's totally fair. And so there were only 3 schools. There was one in Texas, and then so I applied to SMU, Southern Methodist University.
Methodist.
Yeah. So they had a really good oboe professor there, and I picked these schools solely for the music programs, of course, but then specifically the oboe professors because I was going to have to work with them for 2 years, and so I applied for SMU and then also University of Texas Austin, and then also University of Michigan. And so those were the 3 schools that I applied to, and it was solely based on the music program and specifically the oboe professors. And my number one was like University of Michigan because I had just the teacher there is Nancy Ambrose King, who's a world-class soloist and also a professor at University of Michigan. But she her playing is so incredible, and then she's like also the nicest person. Like I lucked up because I was able to work with the nicest people, because not all oboists are nice, and so I really lucked up to meet like the really nice people. And so that was like my dream school. I'm like, okay, if I can get into Michigan and if I can get some sort of scholarship, I really want to go there. And so at this point, since Rochester is closer to Michigan, I was able to get a lesson with her. So I did have a car my senior year because I was doing this internship at a jazz station for extra work.
Like a radio station.
Yeah,
and
it
cool.
was a Jazz 90.1, and it was part of this internship program that you had to do because I was part of the arts leadership program, and so one of the requirements is if you have to get an internship, and so that was the internship that I went with. But they said, hey, you need a car, and I was like, okay, I'll try to figure out how to get a car. So I got a car there, and so I was able to drive to do the lesson, drive to Michigan and meet her, and she was just super happy and bubbly, and we had a great lesson there. And so I was like, okay, I really want to study with her. And so I auditioned a few months later, and then was fortunate enough to get in, and fortunate enough to get a full ride scholarship. I was like, okay, cool.
Wow,
we crossed off.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
This is your master's degree. So you're going to University of Michigan for a master's degree. And University of Michigan has a pretty famous music program. And like for example, like one of the bands that I really like, Wolfpack. My understanding is they all studied there, and they were classmates, and then they formed the band. If you haven't heard Wolfpack, Vulfpec, I think, amazing band. They do kind of like jazzy rock, and or funky rock. The bass player is really good, and what I would say about that is like getting a full ride for a master's degree. A lot of people. Correct me if I'm wrong, if this is a misconception. There's some degree of credential inflation in the sense that what used to be perfectly good, a good enough degree, getting a bachelor's degree, now because so many people, it's so competitive, people are getting master's degrees. And so there's this kind of credential arms race that benefits the university, but does not benefit the people that are taking on debt. So I'm very relieved to hear that you were able to get a full ride scholarship. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Like, is it possible to enter industry with an undergraduate degree, or is it generally like what proportion of your peers went on to go get a master's that stayed in music?
I would say maybe half just got the bachelor's and then they started auditioning professionally, and then the other half got some sort of master's and kept going, and so maybe a little under half there. So I think some people at that point just knew okay, I'm ready. I just want to go straight to auditioning full time, because that I mean, taking auditions, that really is a full time job in and of itself.
Yeah, maybe you can talk about what that's like. You show up, and I mean, how is it different from getting into a music studio when you're trying to get a paid gig?
Yeah, so the way that the auditioning world works, not just for like oboe, but for all like wind instruments and string instruments, is that you hear about auditions and positions opening up, and a lot of times you hear it through the grapevine first, and so you're kind of connected into that world, and you're like, oh, so-and-so's leaving, that means that position's going to be opened up. And so before the official posting goes up, you kind of hear about it so you can start preparing for it. And so once a position opens up, then usually the audition will happen a couple of months after it's initially posted. They'll be like, all right, we're going to hold live auditions and at this place.
A couple
so you
months,
got to pay.
So things move slowly.
Oh, yeah. It's not like, oh, we're going to open it up like, the next weekend. Like usually it's like, okay, the auditions will be, so they might post it in January and they might say something like, oh, the, audition's going to be in April or something like that.
Wow.
And so, yeah, so you're playing this like waiting game. And of course you've got to like, pay bills and stuff like that. And so you work all these like different jobs.
And it's uncertain as to whether you're going to get the job, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
How many people might apply? Like, let's say hypothetically they're in Los Angeles. Excuse me. How many people might be vying for a position in like a symphony or something like that?
Yeah. So specifically within like LA, you have like the big ones like LA Phil, and then Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. So LA Chamber Orchestra actually had an opening a few years back. So tons of people went out for that audition because the thing that's interesting with like technology, we hear about people changing jobs every 2 to 3 years or sometimes less than that. In orchestras, people stay there for 15, 20, 30 years. Like that's like normal. Like people do not switch orchestras every 2 years because it's so hard to get in. And then there's a probationary period. Yeah. It
sounds like it's just like a very coarse kind of like there's a significant transaction costs associated with moving in and out of an orchestra. And earlier I misspoke when I said a symphony. A symphony is a piece of music. It's not the actual body that performs the music. So like how frequently would these positions open up, and how many people? I'm just trying to think of like the sheer volume of work that is done to prepare to audition for, a seat, I guess is, what do they call it in an orchestra?
Yeah. I mean, probably for that LA Chamber Orchestra, there were probably like at least 70 because, that position hadn't been opened up for a while. And so everybody and their mother, of course, was going to go to that audition. And so you're probably looking at least 70 people, if not more, from all across the country there. And so even if you don't live in LA, you would find a way to fly out there and get there and take the audition. So you apply. There's always some sort of application fee that's like $30 or whatever.
There's an application fee to apply for a job.
Yeah. A lot of these have application fees. Not all of them, but some of them actually will tack on an application fee like in college, which I don't really agree with.
I mean, that seems illegal. But
yeah.
I'm just comparing and contrasting. Like, let's say you apply for a job at like Salesforce or something like that. Like, they're going to fly you out there if they think you're a candidate. They're going to put you in a nice hotel. You're going to go and you're going to interview. Then they're going to fly you back. And you're probably going to hear back much faster. And like the whole feedback loop is much tighter than this extremely speculative business of trying to get into an orchestra. I mean, it sounds like a nightmare from coming from the software world. And we can definitely talk in a moment about what it was like to step through the looking glass and see how things were done in software in terms of hiring. But because you've worked as a software engineer at several places now, and so you have like a little bit more context. But yeah, like maybe you could talk. So we can kind of. I don't want to just completely speed through grad school. I'm sure that was an exciting experience too. But I do want to get to software eventually. But
sure.
Like getting into industry as an oboe player, what was that process like?
Yeah, so I spent 2 years in grad school, but I had actually started my sheet music company, JDW Sheet Music, in grad school, and I just whipped up a small website. I had zero clue what I was doing, but I kept talking about it for years, and my friend was just like, when are you going to start this thing? You keep talking about it. I was like, well, I don't know. I don't have any business experience. And he's like, just start it, just figure it out. I was like, okay. And so like, you're being 21, you're just like, all right, I'll just figure it out.
So you were 21, you started the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I started like part-time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I started like part-time, just kind of like on the side. I didn't really know what this thing was going to be, and I had, I think at the time, like 6 pieces that I had arranged on the website. It was just for double reads, and I whipped up a small little website on WordPress and just picked like a WordPress theme, and I was like, okay, let's set some prices and make it live, and I had zero clue what I was doing. I remember my first customer was actually my teacher at grad school. Like, she bought a few pieces for a camp that she was teaching at. I was like, oh, cool, my first customer. And then I had to figure out how to ship music because we didn't have the digital download feature like I do now. And so
you were literally,
that was
like, printing music, and did you like bind it somehow and then ship it, or?
Yeah, so I bought like the binding material, like I bound it myself, and like I shipped it. I shipped every single piece like the first year, and so I didn't sell a whole lot because I wasn't like this was still just kind of like a side thing because I was busy with grad school, and I was like teaching part time in grad school and like performing. And so grad school was very different because with undergrad, it was like tons of coursework and stuff like that, and like rehearsals and stuff. And then grad school was pretty much like I barely had any classes, which I don't know if that's like normal for like
I think
other
that is
masters.
pretty typical. Like, it's less structured, certainly. That like you might have some big project that you're working on, like a dissertation of some sort, or in your case, was there some sort of composition? What was was there like a capstone project, so to speak, for your master's degree?
Yeah. So that we had to do a final recital at the end of our second year, and that was supposed to just be like a representation of like where we were at. And so we got to pick the pieces that we got to perform there, but we got to put together an hour-length recital and perform it for, of course, our teacher and then our peers. And that was, I guess, our capstone project or final project. And so we didn't have to write any like large 20-page papers like some of the other disciplines. Like if I had done a doctorate, then obviously that would have been involved there. But yeah, and so once I finished up with grad school, I was like, I'm done with school. I'm not going to go through a doctorate or anything like that. I'm done. And I wasn't even sure if I was going to stay in Michigan because I loved Michigan. I love Ann Arbor. It's a great town. I hated the weather, so that was a challenge. Yeah. And so I was like, I don't know if I could stay like with this weather. And so I was back and forth, and I was like, you know what? I'll take the risk, and I'll just move back to LA, even though I don't know anybody like in the music space. And so I was like, well, just just dive into there. And
it's a lot more competitive in LA because so many people want to live in LA. And I mean, I don't want to step on anybody's toes in saying this, but to some extent, like, Los Angeles is the kind of like world capital of entertainment, and to an extent, one of the major capitals of arts, right? So I can only imagine like how much more competitive it would be to apply for gigs and jobs in LA versus like, Oklahoma City, for example, where I grew up.
Right. Yeah. And so I decided to just move, and I was like, okay, well, I don't have any money, or I have very little money, so I'm going to move with my grandmother. So my grandmother had like a spare bedroom, and I was like, I'll just move in with her. And it kind of ended up working out because she was more advanced in age, and so she needed somebody to kind of just be there to kind of help her out. So it was kind of a win-win situation. Yeah. And so I moved there. Now at this point we're like around 2015, and I didn't know anybody, and so I was just like, okay, let me start studying the music scene and see what kind of teaching jobs I can get, see who are the contractors, because I went down the freelance route. And so I needed to make relationships with contractors to actually get work, because they were the ones that decided like, okay, who's going to get work, and I wanted to be on those lists. And so I started
what kind
just
of work
like,
is there? Like,
so there's
like session, like recording sessions, or live performances? Like, how would you break out like the different opportunities that an oboe player would?
Yeah, so the basic opportunities, you would get session work, everything from like smaller recording sessions to obviously Disney and stuff like that. But all type of session work actually plays pretty well, even if it's like an independent studio, they still pay their musicians pretty well. And so you do session work, you have teaching. And so a lot of schools will have budgets for like music coaches and teachers to come into the school and teach like private lessons, or they'll teach, like you'll have like a general woodwind instructor or a brass instructor or something like that. And you come in a few times a week and work with the kids. So I had a few of those types of positions there. And then also you play in opera companies. And so there will be smaller opera companies getting their start, and they need musicians. And so if you make relationships, then you're able to get some of those jobs as well. And then also musicals. That one's a little bit harder to come by, just because like most musicals will actually just have what are called like read books, like REED, like read 1 and read 2 books, and they will mainly go to like doublers, woodwind doublers, and these are people that specialize. They play all type of woodwind instruments, so they know how to play flute, clarinet, oboe, bassoon, saxophone.
When you say doubling, sorry to interrupt. When you say doubling, like they would record several instruments on top of one another, so you might only need bring in one musician to fill out like the sound that you're looking for. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So you would bring in these people. Yeah. So if you wanted to bring them in for recordings, you could do that, but also just for the like musicals, like if you were to do a production of like Les Miserables or something like that. I think that one might have an oboe and English horn book, but a lot of these books are just say read 1, and then the read 1 book will be like flute, saxophone, bassoon. And so it's like these assortments, and it's going to be played by one person, and so they'll start off as yeah. So if you ever look inside a pit, if you're going to see a show and they have like live musicians there for a musical, then you will see like all of these army of instruments around them, and so they'll start off with like the flute, and then they'll just drop it, and they'll just pick up the bassoon, and then they'll drop it, and they'll just pick up. And so talk about context switching.
Yeah.
So you have to be like really talented to pull that off. And so I had a few friends that did that, but you can make really good money because obviously you have to like learn all of those really well to be able to pull that off, and so that's also a good career path as well if you want to go down that route. But those are basically the types of jobs that I would do. I would either do recording sessions, and I was always teaching either private studios or going into schools and doing like workshops and stuff like that, and then also doing opera gigs, doing orchestra gigs. So I would get a call and be like, hey, we got this orchestra concert, or we've got this live event, we need an oboist, here it is, or we got this recording session or whatever. And so the early years, you just didn't get as many calls as I would have liked, because I was just getting started. It's really competitive, but I just kept making relationships, and I just kept pounding the pavement, and all the while still on the side, just running my sheet music company. So I was working like a maniac, but I guess that's something you could do when you're 20 something years old. I don't know if I can pull off that schedule today, but back then I was just like, we're just gonna work all the time, whatever. So yeah.
I'm interested for people that are listening to this that are interested in entrepreneurship, because I mean you're a successful entrepreneur in the sense that you created this differentiated product, sheet music, in what I would imagine is a pretty competitive space. People publishing sheet music. How did you differentiate yourself, and how did you find a market within that, you would think, fairly mature space of like printing things and putting them on paper and shipping to people? Like, how did you do that in the mid 20-teens? I think was when you probably started that.
Yeah. At first, like, I didn't really know like who my audience was going to be. I was just like, I'm just going to write for woodwind players, but like, what type of woodwind players? Are these professors? Are these some sort of educators? Are these like soloists? Like, what are they looking for? And so I really had to do some market research on like, what do people actually need? It can't just be stuff that I like. It's like, I got to fulfill some sort of need, or else this is not going to be a business. And so I found out pretty quickly there was like a shift within the communities where there weren't a lot of there were a lot of camps for like orchestra or band if you wanted to do like a summer camp, but there weren't a lot of summer camps or workshops just for particular instruments. So if you wanted to learn more just about trumpet, then you would have to go to like a band camp or an orchestra camp and then take lessons with the teacher. But there weren't really any camps specific to just trumpet or just double reeds or flutes or clarinets or whatever. There was a shift where more and more people started creating these camps. And one of my friends, Jennifer, she created this whole company called Vocal Majority, and it's a series of camps that are taught all throughout the year, mainly in the summer. But she had started this right around the same time I had started JDW Sheet Music, And I remember when I went to a conference and she had one small little table off to the corner, and I, spotted her, and I was like, I'm just going to go around and talk to a whole bunch of people. And so she was one of the people I talked to. And that was her dream of just like having these camps all over the place, and it really blew up, and like that's her like full-time job. Like she has a storefront now. It's kind of crazy. And
so you
kind
were
of
like an early vendor for her.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially.
Yeah, because like she had this dream of like having these double reed camps, but of course there's not a lot of double reed just oboe, or like she wanted to have like oboe choirs and like oboe and bassoon choirs, but obviously there's not a lot of music for that, and so I would literally write music to accommodate these types of camps. And so once I found that niche, I was like, okay, people are looking for stuff. And I found that educators, even within more popular instruments like clarinet and flute and trumpet, they were still looking for duets that they could play with their students. They were still looking for those type of music, even though there's tons of flute music and trumpet music. They were still looking for duets. And so I started cranking out tons of duets and trios. It's like smaller chamber groups there. And that's
so many questions. First of all, when you say double reed, you're talking about instruments that have two reeds.
So double reed would be oboe and bassoon instruments there.
Okay, and then so it's very specialized in the sense that you're just creating sheet music for these two instruments, really. And then is your market mostly educators then? Would you say that like what proportion of the people who would buy your sheet music were educators?
Yeah, I would say like the majority were educators. So I started with double reeds, and then I expanded out into flutes and clarinets and trumpets. And so now it's for mainly winds with a little bit of string music as well. But that was really the niche, because educators, mainly like private school, or not private school, like private teachers were always looking for more music. And then also even public school teachers, because they would have chamber music built into some of their curriculums, and they were always looking for more music, whether it's flute music or trumpet music. And so that's when I really like honed in, and I started creating different pedagogy books addressing common issues for these particular instruments. And I started writing music for that. So I had like a couple of little funny, cheeky titles. Like for oboe, there's an issue where you don't know which F to use, because on the oboe there's different Fs that you can actually use. And a lot of students don't know which one to use in the appropriate situation. So I literally created a book like what F to use, and like everybody thought that was hilarious, because they're like, oh my gosh, I run into this problem all the time. So I identified like instrument specific like issues people were running into, and would write like these little books about them and have like exercises. And then that was when things really took off in the music education market. And so once I started getting sales through that, and it really boosted sales, then I wanted other people to carry my music, but I was having a hard time initially because they're like, oh, you're just some small time, whatever. And so I was like, I got to get a big fish so people will take me seriously. So I went to J.W. Pepper, which is like this really big retailer for music education. They've been around for God knows how many years at this point, but they're a really, really big fish. Everybody knows them in the music education space. And I went to them and I said, look, I have a really successful line of these teaching books that you don't currently carry, that is needed in the market. Here are my numbers, and you should carry them. And they're like, that works for me, sold. And so they started selling my music on their site. And once I got them on, then I was able to start, telling people and being like, hey, I want to expand the number of people that are going to retail my music. We already have JW Pepper. It'd be great if you could join our list. They're like, oh, you're a Pepper. Okay, cool. So once I drop their name, they're like, oh, you must be legit. I was like, that's what I told you.
So you established kind of proof of concept in you as a sheet music proprietor, for lack of a better word. Yeah. I'm sure there's a better word than that. But that's so cool. First, I have some observations about this. This is I didn't know any of this stuff before I asked the question, by the way. I just knew you had this is a reasonably successful organization where you were bringing in enough money to justify continuing business operations, right? Which I consider a success. If there's demand, if you've got traction, then that is a successful venture in my mind. So much of what you did was just leveraging your own tacit knowledge of going through education, music education throughout your childhood, throughout adulthood, in going to these camps, going to retreats, going through the studio system, getting into universities. Like, so you had all this knowledge of what was lacking and how it could be improved upon. And so you stepped forward yourself. You had the confidence to go ahead and try to fill that vacuum yourself. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, and second, you had the audacity to do this. I'm sure a lot of people are like, man, so frustrating that there's not the right sheet music for this specific type of thing, but they don't do anything about it. You did something about it. You built a website and you started printing it and shipping it. Right?
Right. Yeah. And then there was an interesting shift where I was shipping things for the first few years, but then I was studying, I was going to the dashboard and I wanted to see where our customers were coming from, how many people would actually add something to the cart and then leave the cart. Why are they doing that? Like, I don't want them to leave the cart without buying, like, because then I don't make money. So I started studying that, and I noticed that a lot of people outside of the States would literally put things in their cart and then just abandoned their cart. And I was like, why are they doing this? And then I quickly realized, like, oh, crap. Okay, it's obviously expensive to, like, they didn't justify, which makes sense. It's like, okay, I'm going to buy this sheet music and then I'm going to pay all this much in shipping just for my sheet music. I'm like, yeah. That makes sense. And so there were a lot of people from Europe and Asia that were literally coming to my site, putting things in their cart and then abandoning their cart. I was like, oh, crap, this sucks. Like, I'm losing
shipping
money.
Costs. Shipping costs. Like, I think
yeah.
Amazon figured that out pretty early. That's like the biggest deterrent to a transaction. That's why they're so big on free shipping and stuff, and like getting people into the Prime recurring revenue scheme that they've got going there. So digital printing was one of the innovations, which, I mean, ebooks have been a thing for decades plus at this point, like certainly in mainstream consciousness. But were people using like iPads while they were performing and stuff already, or how hard was it to get people to pay for something that was digital?
Yeah, I think the industry was slowly shifting into that. And in terms of people performing right off of their iPads, it started coming around like early, or I guess like 2007, 8, 9 was like the first time that I remember I saw a doctoral recital where he played everything off his iPad and he had like the foot pedals. And I was like, well, this is weird, you know? And so even back then, to turn the page, I was like, oh, this is weird.
A page turner who had to watch along. At least with piano, I still see this.
Piano,
Yeah, like somebody who's watching who can read the notes and knows exactly where you are and flips the page very gracefully at exactly the right time. So you just, not have to move your hands off the piano, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so like he was using this iPad and like the foot pedals. I was like, that's weird. And he was playing saxophone. I was like, dude, just use a stand and sheet music. But like the industry was slowly but surely like moving in that direction, and more people. I'd say nowadays more people. Some people still prefer just the regular paper, but some people like that option. And so since we were shifting in that direction, digital downloads became more and more of a thing for sheet music retailers and publishers. And so I was like, okay, we've got to find a way to let people like buy this music there, and like it shouldn't cost them all this in shipping if they live outside of the States. And so that's when I made the shift to like actually make it digital download. So I went through and revamped the site and made sure that people could actually download the music. So of course you had to like buy it first. You can't just like randomly download it without paying for it. But once you go through the checkout process, then you will get an email that says, congrats, thanks for your purchase. And then here's the download link. And so implementing that was like a game changer because it like boosted my sales, because now people that weren't in the States could actually buy my music and then just like download it straight into whatever device there. And I was like, okay, that's the best move right there. And the good thing is too, like whether I'm on vacation or something like that I'm still like getting downloads, and like just a few days ago I was getting multiple downloads and stuff like that while I was sleeping. So it was kind of cool to still get people like buying my music while I'm sleeping and make money while I'm asleep. I was like, that's what we're doing there. And I don't have like the transactions done.
Successful operation, right? You don't even have to be awake to get transactions done. And that's the power of software, is essentially you're kind of cloning yourself or cloning parts of yourself. The part that would pitch, oh, this is the sheet music you want, or, oh, yeah, here, can you give me your credit card number? Like, that's how business used to be done. It used to be an incredibly manual process with the internet and automating things through websites and things like. And I just want to emphasize, you are your own developer. You're an entrepreneur who is building and maintaining this e-commerce site by yourself. Did you use like any frameworks or like tools? Like I know a lot of people nowadays use like Gumroad and things like that for selling digital download type items. Did you use any of those, or did you just roll your own and use different libraries? How did you do it?
Yeah. So I started off with just a basic WordPress site, picked out a theme, and then used everything for the actual transaction with WooCommerce because it came with your own dashboard, and then it worked with PayPal. And so I figured that was the way to go. And to this day, it still works that way because I was like, well, if it's not broke, let's not fix it.
Every WordPress dev I know is like, it's not broke, I'm not going to swap out completely from the WordPress ecosystem. A lot of folks using WooCommerce. It seems like a pretty good setup. Like it's good enough, right?
Yeah. I mean, it works really well, and the digital download aspect works really well, and so I decided to just stick with it because at that point I hadn't learned how to code or anything like that, and so once I did learn how to code, I was like, should I revamp it? And I was like, well, it works and it's bringing in money. Yeah. So I was like, no, I'm not going to. I'm not going to touch it.
Yeah, engineers often like kind of bristle at the like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I myself am a I guess promulgator of that philosophy, at least when it's concerning things that it would take a ton of time and energy to swap things out, you know? And I think that's why like 35% of all websites are on WordPress to this day. Like a significant chunk of the web runs on WordPress just because there are a whole lot of webmasters, to use the very old term,
right.
who are thinking if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like it's good enough. Yeah. So maybe you can talk about as you became more technical while maintaining this website, like what were some of the things you did using your burgeoning developer powers?
Yeah, so by the time the pandemic happened, that's when I started learning how to code, and I started looking at the site, and I was like, oh, maybe I could tweak it here and there and tweak the user experience this way, and like start to beef up some of our metrics and stuff like that. So I kind of just made small tweaks here and there just to kind of increase, just better the user experience, and then also increase like my experience of just tracking orders and stuff like that. And so I never really made any like super major overhauls because I was just like, I don't want to touch it because like there's money coming from there still, even though I don't run it full time anymore. I'm just like, I don't want to touch it there and like do some major overhaul and disrupt things. And so I would just go in and start making small tweaks here and there with the skills that I've learned over time. But yeah, that's always been my philosophy. So I don't know if I'll ever do like a major overhaul of it. I'll probably just small tweaks here and there over time and just keep that thing running as just like a side project now. And
so you worked as a professional musician, of course. You were. Can you catch us up on how you progressed as a musician once you were back in LA?
Yeah, the first few years, it was just a few gigs here and there, and so I would supplement income with just like random jobs and stuff like that. And
what would a random job be? Like teaching gigs and things like that, or
just be like different teaching gigs or whatever performance gigs I could get, I would take. And later on, if they were like paying a whole lot, that I would have the freedom to say no. But in the early days, I was like, well, this doesn't pay a lot, but I need the money. I got bills to pay. So even though I didn't have to pay housing, I still had like other bills and stuff to pay. So I was just like, well, we'll just take whatever gig comes my way. And so I would teach all over LA Unified and out near Santa Clarita, which is like 50 minutes drive away. And so I would just teach all over the place. I teach out in Burbank and stuff like that, and just would find whatever gigs possible. And there was a period of time where I would also I started this program called the Musical Story Time, where I would go out into libraries, public libraries, and I would go into private preschools and kindergartens and charge them a fee and play there. And so I just did whatever I could. And sometimes I drove DoorDash, and I worked government jobs. And so it was just like, whatever puts food on the table, like we're just going to grind it out there. So I just did kind of whatever I needed to do those first few years until I built up more of a steady place of just music-centered stuff. But those early years, it was just like whatever I could get, like whatever pays the bills. I'm just up for anything there. So those were the early days. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds really pragmatic. And then actually kind of like breaking through and actually working as a musician, like in terms of like having proper musical gigs in addition to your more entrepreneurial stuff with like the library system and things like that. What was that like?
Yeah, I think the turning point was like a couple of years being into LA. I started getting more in contact with more prominent contractors that had the really good gigs, like if you wanted to get calls for like the Grammys or something like that, or like live events or recording sessions. So once I started making those types of relationships, then they would be like, all right, cool. We'll do you want to play for this orchestra? And then once I did good in that gig, then my name would start to get passed around. So that was really the turning point where I started making an impression on some of the larger music contractors out there and starting to get paid for more. And so that was a nice turning point, going from like just small little gigs to like, oh, this actually pays something, like this is actually nice. And so, and getting like back-to-back gigs, because like contractors of course know other contractors, etc., and so they pass your name around, and so it was really nice to be on those types of lists. And at that point then I didn't have to do as much like random jobs. I could really just hone in and have my performance jobs and a smaller amount of teaching jobs, and still have the sheet music business running. But that was a good shifting point. So that was around like 2018 or so is when things really started to kind of take off. And I was like, oh, this is what it feels like to have like, real money for the first time and not be like surviving. Because those first few years, it was just like literally paycheck to paycheck. There would be times where it's like, okay, we still have like hundreds of dollars worth of bills to pay. I don't even know where this money's going to come from. We got to figure it out. So coming from like that to going like, oh, I actually have plenty of money to do like auto pay and not worry that the money's not going to be taken out. So that shift was like really cool when like things really started to gel with not only the business, but then also with the music part. I was like, this is what real money feels like. That's kind of cool.
Was there a moment where you felt like I've made it as a musician? Like I can do this. This can be my career long term. Did you reach that moment?
I think when I started getting calls, there was one call that there was a couple of calls. So I got a call to do a gig with Fox Studios to be a part of, I don't know if you are familiar with the show, The Orville. And it's on Fox there. It's by Seth MacFarlane. It's like a space comedy type thing. And so I remember getting a call.
Parody?
Yeah, like a spoof kind of like on Star Trek. Yeah. And so I remember getting that call. And that was from a larger like contractor that had given my name. And then I had also gotten a call, like the last recording session I did was for Netflix. And it was this Netflix animated short. So getting like those types of calls where I was like, that's kind of cool. And like it was so different because like some of those like early gigs, it was like, well, we'll pay you a little bit. And then they were always like behind and it was super disorganized versus like when like someone from Netflix calls you, they're like, oh, we have this recording project and everything like runs accordingly and they pay you right there. You're like, okay, this is great. I can get used to this, So it was just like night and day from like the hot mess early gigs that I went through versus like getting there. And then also getting called to do the Grammys, even though that didn't like, end up going through. Just getting that call, I was like, oh, okay, it was nice to get the call, even though unfortunately talking about like the cutthroatness of the industry, I had gotten a call to do the Grammys in 2020 of all years. So of course this is when things fall apart because it's 2020, and so I got a call to perform for a very major artist, and I won't name the name there, but they're a very major artist. Here, I'll share it in chat so you can see. But getting that call, I was like, oh, I'm on that list? I didn't even know. Whoa. Wow, that's kind of crazy. And so, and unfortunately, they had contacted like 40 of us and got like soft approvals from us. And then they went in a different creative direction and they were like, oh, we want to go from 40 to like 9. And I was like, what? Why? I was already excited about this.
Yeah.
And so I was like, and this like happens like all the time where people will just like change their mind. I'm like, the music industry, it sucks. And so, but it was cool to like get that call, and I was like, okay,
Yeah.
well, I'll take that as a win though, because not everybody gets called to do the Grammys. So
Yeah, well,
I'll take
let's
it.
talk about 2020, because that was the year that so much of the music industry kind of like, that was an inflection point, frankly. Especially like if you're doing like live events or events where people have to congregate to perform. That was
Right.
basically, they put a kibosh on that, right? And as far as I can tell, so many musicians immediately lost their livelihood. How were you affected by that?
Yeah, that time was like crazy because it was full steam ahead. I was doing like, I had done a concerto performance, I had done a few like music festivals, like I was just booked up. And then like 2 weeks earlier I was at Disneyland because I was one of the music coaches for the band. And we did this like really cool workshop with Disney, and I remember it was like, it's, you know, Disney on a Friday, Disneyland on a Friday, so it's like packed, and people were like, oh, are you worried about this like COVID thing? I was like, no, we'll be cool, you know, not knowing that like the whole world would fall apart like 2 weeks later. So I was like way off mark with that. And so when the shutdown happened and they shut down, you know, they declared it was a pandemic, and then LA Unified, I remember being at a school teaching, and we were all monitoring our phones, like, are they going to close down LA Unified? Are they going to close it down? Because we knew if they closed LA Unified, they were going to close everything. Because LA Unified is like the largest one besides probably New York, I would imagine, school district there. And so we weren't sure if they were going to like close us down, and they did. And I was like, oh man, this is bad. I don't know what's going to happen. So when they told us like, you know, go home and stay home, I was like, what am I supposed to do? And so literally in one day, all of my gigs that I had booked up until like September basically just disappeared.
Like 7 or 8 months worth of gigs, essentially. 6 or 7
Exactly,
months,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I can only imagine how hard it is to get those bookings. It's probably very hard to build those relationships, maintain them. You probably have to sell yourself a lot, getting on the call and like, oh yeah, I can make that. Right, It doesn't just happen. The business doesn't just roll in like it might for a star developer, for example. Right,
right. Yeah, and so like I had finally gotten to a point where I had a booked up calendar all the way up until fall, and then like in one day it was just all of these emails of like, this is canceled, this is canceled, this is canceled. I'm like, this is like tens of thousands of dollars. I'm like, what am I supposed to do? And so I was like, man, this sucks. And so the only income I had coming in was from the sheet music, so I was able to live off of that, and just kind of live on a tighter budget, because I wasn't, obviously didn't have access to the other income. But I really felt for those that had zero income, especially those that you work so hard to get to places like New York Phil. Like I had friends at the New York Phil that had to move out of New York. Yeah, the Philharmonic, and they had to move out of New York back in with their parents or friends or because they were getting paid. And New York Phil, like they pay a lot. Like they pay like a lot, comparable to like a senior developer. And so you're getting paid, $180, $190 plus $1,000 a year. So you go from that to zero is straight up terrifying, especially in New York. And so that was a really scary time for all musicians, where a lot of us were either like living on other types of income, or a lot of my friends were going off of unemployment and stuff like that. And so it was just like, this is a crazy time. And we weren't, of course, sure at the time how long this pandemic was going to last there. And so a lot of people started just driving for like Uber and DoorDash, or just whatever type of jobs that they can get a hand on just to survive. And at that time we still had like the $600 a week, at least for a little bit, so some people were able to get that, but it was not US,
like the kind of like stimulus funds
or stimulus pack. It was like $600 a week, so I had friends that were getting that, and they were really grateful for that, because that's like, that's still pretty good money there. But still, it was kind of crazy at the time.
Yeah, well, thank goodness you built kind of a side business that could help supplement your income. And that's definitely like an argument for diversifying your revenue sources as a professional. What point did you really start thinking like, I should get more into coding? You've been maintaining your website, you've learned a little bit of stuff, but like, when did you really kind of like double down on coding and decide that this was an area that you really wanted to build out?
Yeah, I think there were like two things that happened. One was, so I started learning in 2020, and only just because I wanted to build out the Black Excellence Music Project.
Let's talk about
the story. Yeah. The story behind that was, so now we're at June of 2020. The world is like a mess, and George Floyd had just been murdered, and there were a lot of conversations about race relations and the lack of diversity in many industries, including the one I was currently in, which was specifically not just the music industry, but the classical like world. There's not exactly a lot of Black and Latino representation compared to white, and so a lot of people were asking me about like, oh, I want to learn more about Black composers for the past and present. So I was like sending them links to just random sites that I had found. And I was like, well, this is crazy. There should just be one site instead of like 6 or 7. And if people can't find this on their own, there should just be one that can be easily found.
Yeah.
And so that's when I started building out what is called the Black Excellence Music Project. And version 1 was built with vanilla HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. And after a few months of learning, I think I was like 5 months in, I had finally just pressed, publish. I was like, okay, it's going to go out there, and we're just going to see what happens. And I released it just before, I believe it was Black History Month of 2021, and I started just emailing it to my friends that were teachers, and they're like, oh, this is incredible, I'm going to use it in my class. I started sharing it in different social media, and so it got really popular. And then I had a few friends that were at the college level that were like, hey, I want you to come and do a workshop with us. I was like, that's cool. So I was kind of riding that wave for a little bit, and then I decided to revamp it and do a version 2 built with React and Tailwind CSS, and add even more profiles and games and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I really started just falling in love with learning and coding, and I had gone through parts of the freeCodeCamp curriculum, doing the first few certifications, and I still wasn't sure if I was going to make the switch and actually make a career change, because the world kind of started opening up. I started getting calls again and recording sessions, but it was in this like really weird post-COVID world where it was just like, you could come in, but then you're going to have to be in this separate room, and we're going to have to wait till it's like sterilized and all this. I was like, well, this is not fun, And so I wasn't sure if I was going to like keep on going, because everything had just changed, and I wasn't as excited about getting back into things or what the quote unquote new normal was gonna be about. And I was like, I don't know, I kind of like this coding thing, but do I want to be a software developer? Like, what does that look like? And so I just vacillated that whole first year of like, do I want to do this? Do I not? And the real turning point came when I had a big job opportunity come up from Disney, and I turned it down to pursue software. I was like,
wow.
okay, I guess since I turned it down, I guess we're actually going to do this software thing.
So
that
your
was
heart
like the
was already
turning point.
kind of in software.
It was
like
it's
really
crazy.
knowing until you had this great musical opportunity. And it's like kind of like the two worlds, and you deciding which path you want to take, like a literal fork in the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I said no to the Disney offer, I was like, well, I guess we're going in this other direction, and luckily everything worked out. But yeah.
And let's talk about your career as a developer. So obviously you were very active on the forum. You were running, of course, your sheet music business. You were still performing a little bit, and I saw you early on just how. Obviously you've got a ton of teaching experience. Teaching oboe, teaching other, musical concepts at so many different levels. And that immediately jumped out like, wow, she's really good at teaching. She's really good at communicating concepts. She's probably, teaching a lot of programming concepts that she only recently learned herself. So the turnaround is really quick in terms of, and I always tell people like the best way to learn something really well is to practice it a lot, but also to teach it to other people. There's that Einstein quote that if you don't understand something well enough to explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't sufficiently understand the concept yourself. So you immediately jumped out at me as a teacher. Of course, freeCodeCamp's entire staff is like developers / teachers. Many of us have classroom teaching experience. Many of us have experience writing books and tutorials. Of course, you wrote a ton of popular FreeCodeCamp tutorials. I think we were just checking a minute ago, and like in the past 28 days, like more than 400,000 people have read some of your tutorials that you published on FreeCodeCamp. So even to this day, even though now you're mostly focused on the curriculum, you have. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that process of like, okay, now I've just turned on this Disney. Like, how am I going to keep the proverbial lights on working as a developer, and what your next steps were?
Yeah, I had a like very unique developer journey because I think a lot of people that like transition into tech, they think, okay, I'm gonna immediately try to get a job within 6 months or 9 months. And my whole thing was like I wasn't really sure how this was gonna play out, and so I just assumed that I was just gonna be kind of floating around and not be noticed by anybody. And it like kind of didn't work out that way. Like I was able to not only start contributing more to FreeCodeCamp, but then also I got my first contract work as a junior dev from the forum, because I was just all over the forum, just kind of answering questions and just participating in the conversations, to the point where a senior developer who ran his own company, he reached out to me. He was like, hey, like, you're super active. We're looking for a junior dev to come on part-time. I was like, I've only been doing this for a few months. Like, are you sure? And he was like, yeah, I totally get that you're still early on, but you seem to pick up things quickly, and you seem like you will learn a lot, and we could throw you in the deep end and you'll figure it out. I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, I can do that. And so I got my first contract job, and I was like working like part-time for this like small like tech company, working mainly in the front end, a little bit in the back end there. And so it was just kind of crazy how that just materialized, just because I was like super active online. I was like really active on Twitter and like different Discord groups, and so my name kind of kept popping up, and like I had a few people reach out and be like, oh, we're looking for a junior dev. And this like period job market was like 2021, 2022, where things were still pretty good. This is like prior to 2023, where things just like fell apart. So the job market was much more like healthier, and that's where people were like, oh, we have extra money and we can bring you on as a junior. I was like, yeah, that's cool. And so I just started like working my way up through different companies and getting that like hands-on experience, which is what every career changer wants. They just want that first opportunity. So I kind of like lucked up where I was like, oh, this is kind of nice to get like these first few jobs and get that experience going. And so it was kind of cool and unexpected there, but really fortunate that it worked out that way.
Yeah. And it sounds like so you were able to leverage your reputation, having just been a prolific helper on the FreeCodeCamp forum, like posting, answering people's questions. And interestingly, like the FreeCodeCamp forum, it's not about answering questions so much as asking further questions and guiding people toward kind of answering their own question, almost like a Socratic method. And that's something you've certainly espoused, and a lot of the more prolific forum moderators are big fans of, like, not literally answering the person's question, but instead, why are you asking that question? What process led you to this specific question that you're asking, and making people introspect a little bit more and actually struggle with the content that they're trying to learn. And I think most teachers can identify with that. Like, oh yeah, that does work more, because you're not like, if they just want the literal answer, they can type it into Google. But if they actually want to understand why that's the answer, they should go hang out on the forum, right? Or they should ask one of their friends that does software development. So you alluded to, like, of course, like late 2023, there were a number of big layoffs in tech, and that had kind of like this cascading effect. What I often tell people is, software development is a squiggly line that's generally going up and to the right, and there will be a correction in, if there hasn't already, the total number of developer jobs will go back to where it was. A lot of people attributed those, those job layoffs to AI, but I don't think that plays a big part. And most people I've talked to who, worked at big companies like the founders of Stack Overflow, I interviewed both of them on the podcast separately, and talked to a bunch of other people in tech. And I don't think very many people think that AI is the reason that software developers are getting laid off. Much more likely, it's interest rates have changed in the United States. So, investment and all this stuff, I won't break out the macroeconomics or anything. Not that I'm necessarily qualified to explain it, but when it's harder to get money to keep your business going, and when, like interest rates changing affects stock prices and other things like that. And companies do layoffs, and there's kind of like a herd mentality around layoffs. A lot of companies don't ever do layoffs. Apple has never done a major layoff, for example. Like there are lots of very well-run companies that don't have to do layoffs because they plan accordingly. And then when I say herding, like a lot of companies, they'll see like, oh, company XYZ just laid off a bunch of people. We're cool to lay off some people too. And like managers will, it's a short-term fix, like cutting costs. But what you're really doing is you're shedding a whole bunch of people from your organization who are already effectively working, whom you spent a great deal of time and money hiring to bring them on. So generally you don't lay somebody off unless you absolutely have to, or you don't know what you're doing as a manager, which unfortunately is the case at a lot of big Fortune 500 companies in the United States. So, so you were working at freeCodeCamp part-time, and, you know, like a lot of the opportunity on the side kind of evaporated, so to speak, or it certainly got harder to get gigs and things like that as a freelance dev. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I just want to make sure I'm not mischaracterizing what happened or anything, but you did say that like the market kind of tightened for developer talent, and many people would argue that it is still harder to get a developer job today than it was in early 2023. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you just have more people out there on the market. And so there was this interesting shift where like 2020, 2021, 2022, the money was flowing. Companies were hiring like crazy, including like my previous company. Like when I was hired on, they hired so many other people, including more juniors, mids, seniors, architects. It was just like money was flowing for everyone, and like all of my friends that were working too had the same thing, where like there was all of this just money flowing around, where people were just hiring, and you didn't even have to really, like Danny Thompson has this funny thing where he says on a lot of his Twitter spaces where he's like, there was a time where like if you just knew what a function was, you could get a job, and like of course he's like kind of making a joke of it, but there kind of was a time where like you know, you really didn't have to try like that much. Like if you had some sort of basic skills, you can code something, they're like, hey, we'll take it, we'll work with it there. And so you didn't have to put in that much energy into your resume, like, or you know, networking and stuff. And then everything shifted at the end of 2022 and going into 2023, where the money stopped flowing like it was. Companies were losing money on products and services, and then they were looking at their balance sheet and they're like, I don't know if we can afford all these people. And so that's when they started just cutting people. And so I was part of the layoffs for my last company there because they were going through financial tough times, and a lot of my friends were being laid off as well for the same reasons. And so now you have this whole flood of people coming from big and small companies out on the market. Now recruiters aren't just sending you messages like they were prior. Now it's like hard to get a hold of a lot of recruiters, and you got to try extra hard and make sure your LinkedIn's nice and polished, and you have this like really, really strong resume, and making sure that you're networking and building connections there, and so there's extra things you have to do. And so I think a lot of people just weren't used to that, especially people that have been in this industry 5 or 7+ years. Where they really didn't have to try that hard. Like they could just rely on their skills and talent. Now they're just like, now I have to, you know, constantly be updating my resume and have a LinkedIn profile and do all this networking. Like they didn't have to do that before because they just relied on their skills and someone would just hire them. And it's not that way anymore.
We were in kind of like a privileged time in between busts. So you could look at like the .com bust as, you know, definitely a decrease in demand for developers. You'd also look at 2008, even though that was more of the financial sector, it had significant repercussions for the job market for developers as well. And then, of course, recently there's just been this huge buildup as I always say this, like tech will always kind of be expanding, certainly like on a longer timeline, even though it's like this sine wave, you know, the diagonal sine wave. Because everybody wants to push everything to the software layer. Precisely what we were talking about, like the, you know, e-commerce, right? You used to have, you know, call centers and people would call in and they make an order, and you know, that would be like the physical postage layer. There'd be like all these different things that now are handled by software, and software is the act of automating things. and therefore it will be the last thing that gets completely automated, in my humble opinion. Like I think developers' jobs are as safe as jobs, human jobs are. I think ultimately it's probably the safest profession to be in. Now, at the same time, you're going to have to like skill up and like be much more aggressive about improving your skills. And you're not like, it's not going to be like The Simpsons where you're just walking down the street and the limo pulls up and offers you the job, right? That doesn't
Right.
happen for developers in 2023 or 2024. And it's not that that was almost kind of a period of aberration, but in every other industry, I mean, we talked about how hard it is to get a job in music, right? That's
Right.
a pretty extreme example, but you could argue that it's similar in like finance. It's probably similar in like a lot of the healthcare space, a lot of like real estate space, service industry. Like we were in a very fortuitous position as software developers the past 8 or 10 years, and it may be a little bit leaner for a little while, but I do think that we'll get back to a point, maybe not quite as auspicious as a time as just passed, but it'll still be a good actual career that's worth investing time and energy and getting into. It's just that like they're kind of like the fair weather people who are just looking for a good job that is reliable, that has high income. And I totally don't fault people for that. You've got family back in your country. You got to remit as much money as possible to them, or you have a bunch of kids. You just need to pay the bills and keep the lights on. But, I do think it's going to become easier for people to get jobs in tech than it is right now. But
Right.
So
Yeah.
I just want to be sure to sufficiently address this because it comes up all the time in the comments. Like people are like, "Oh, why are you even teaching people to learn to code anymore? It's over." No, it's not over. Who the heck thinks it's over? Like only the most pessimistic, person who's completely out of the loop with the macro trends that are happening in society with technology would think that software development is over as a field. I'm very bullish on it, but at the same time, we have to talk pragmatically. Like there are going to be ups and downs in everything. And so I'll get off my soapbox, but I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that a lot of people who are feeling angst about what's happening in software development and are feeling like, should I really invest time and energy? I mean, first of all, you're going to be doing this for several years, probably before you're going to be at the level where you can go out and get a job as a software engineer. And, you should still invest that time. The market is almost certainly going to improve over the next 3 or 4 years. So don't feel reticent about like, going ahead and investing that time and energy right now and expanding your skills. Sorry. I know that this is not like the Quincy Larson interview. It's an interview with Jessica Wilkins.
It's okay.
Let's get back to talking with you. But what do you think about that? Like, do you have anything to add to that notion that the market will eventually bounce back, but that it's totally understandable why a lot of folks are like disenchanted right now?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get it, especially if people are just learning. Maybe they're in the first few months of learning, or maybe they've been learning this past year, and they're just like, man, it just feels impossible to get in and to stay in. That's totally valid feelings, but I would just encourage them. One of the things that I feel like I tell people if they want to go into any career is talk to somebody that's been around way longer than you have, that's been in a career for 15, 20 plus years. And I've been fortunate enough to talk to those people that have seen those ups and downs. And they're like, look, yeah, this does, suck right now. It's not great, but it will bounce back. And they're right. Like they've been able to survive all of the craziness over the past couple of decades. And so I think a lot of times people coming in that are newer, they're only seeing the right now. They don't see the bigger picture. And so talking to people that have been in this industry 10, 15, 20 plus years will ease your nerves. And it doesn't help that there's a lot of talk on social media from like these influencers that there's some really good influencers, but there's some that, oh man, they're not good at, like, do not listen to these people because they're just preying on, like, they just ride the wave of the doom and gloom. And there's all these videos of like, this is the end of software and all this other stuff. I'm like, oh no,
hyperbole.
And so
and I understand they're just trying to like build up their own following and everything, but follow Danny Thompson. He's a positive, pragmatic, realistic dude, and we were talking about him earlier. And there's an interview that I did with him a few months ago. I'm very proud of that interview, and I encourage everybody, if you're looking for some positive energy and you want to hear from somebody who has gone from frying chicken at a gas station to working as a software engineer at big tech companies and creating a course directly with LinkedIn about how to use LinkedIn. It's like one of their official courses, and it's free, by the way.
Right.
I'm going to add a link to that in case anybody wants to watch that in the show notes. But keeping a positive attitude and accepting that like there's always going to be some amount of doom and gloom, but the doom and gloom is out much, in stronger, forces than normal right now.
Right. And I think too, speaking about like AI, like a lot of people are straight up terrified that, okay, what's the point of learning if they're this Chat GPT, all these tools, it could just code for me. And here's the thing, I think like it could whip up small, simple things. You give it a very direct prompt, it will give you some sort of answer. But I think for those that haven't worked in software and don't realize, it's not just going to be some simple prompt. Like your client isn't going to come to you and be like, here is a very direct prompt. I want this and this and this and this. And you're like, oh, great. All of that's super clear. I'll just whip up a website for you. I'll whip up this application. Like that is not how this works. There's so much back and forth. And a lot of times clients don't even know what they really want. They'll say one thing and you're like, is that really what you want? And then you start talking to them. You're like, no, actually, you kind of want this thing. Okay. And so you have to kind of peel back those layers. And really good software engineers that have been around for a while, they can kind of read between the lines and know how to design systems that are going to last a really long time and give the client exactly what they need. And so ChatGPT and all these other tools, they're just tools, but they're not going to replace really good software engineers because it's not just about just showing up and just be like, oh, here's a simple prompt, just whip it up and, go to lunch and you're off on your day. Like you're solving complex problems and there's a lot of nuance to those types of problems and you have to think about it for a while. And ChatGPT is just not there yet. It can help you break down some of that, but it's not there to just whip up a solution with vague information because a lot of times you'll just get vague requirements from your client and you're like, I don't really know how to break this down. A
huge part of working with clients is understanding what they don't know that they want, and being able to guide them through that massive decision tree that isn't even mapped out. It just kind of comes up through these client meetings, showing them your work, showing them like a bunch of ideas that you mocked up in Figma or something like that, and getting them to gradually arrive at consensus of, oh yeah, this is what we should do. We didn't know that we needed to do that. Having to go do research and figure out what would be a good approach to solving a particular problem. A huge amount is interpersonal relationships. It's communication. I always like to say that like code is just the act of a human trying to communicate with a computer. The most succinct explanation of what should be done in different circumstances and everything like that is the actual code. Code is just a very terse, machine readable language for articulating like in this very specific situation where the client has done all this stuff and is doing this, we need to check and make sure that they did that. And then we need to handle this situation this way. Right. That's what building software is. It's not like, oh, I took a photo of this napkin and it built me a website, so I guess I don't need a web developer anymore. Like that was kind of like a very cool demo that was done with like early versions of a lot of these multimodal AI systems and LLMs and stuff. And it's cool. It's impressive. I just want to say, like, I'm not an AI hater. I use AI all the time. I ask ChatGPT 4, like GPT running ChatGPT running GPT-4. I ask it questions all the time, and I'll use other LLMs as well just to see, like, learn more about how they respond to things. And I'm getting better at like figuring out, oh, you're hallucinating there because that's not true. And a lot of it is just knowing how to parse the feedback you get from a system like that. That's a lot of the utility is just getting experience using it and already knowing a whole lot about the domain you're asking about, right? Like if you were to ask it about, black composers, for example, that's a subject you know a great deal about, right? Or oboe performance or sheet music or, like aspects of contract web development that you've done over the past 3 or 4 years, right? Like you're going to be able to figure out where it knows what it's talking about and where it doesn't. And you're going to be able to prompt it more precisely and get it to acknowledge that it's made some error using the reflection technique and all this stuff, right? Like I can talk, I can have extremely nuanced conversations with GPT about specific areas that I have domain expertise in. And I think that's one of the beauties of that tool. But at the same time, there's a reason why 400,000 people are reading articles written by Jessica Wilkins each month. It's because they're really good, useful articles, and it's way better than the kind of like off-the-cuff response that GPT is going to give if people ask comparable questions. So I think to some extent, and we haven't really talked about, content creation, which is essentially what you're doing when you're writing articles. But to some extent, there's a flight to quality. There's going to be like all this AI-generated, dribble, for lack of a better term. There are going to be entire websites that rank very well on Google that are just, and Google knows that people are using AI to generate articles and stuff. FreeCodeCamp, we use AI all the time, but everything goes through an editor. Probably like 95 to 100% of the words that I write. Well, I can tell you 100% of the words that I write are created by me. I don't use AI for actually creating copy. What I'll do is I'll use AI for doing research, right? Mm-hmm. Like along with reading all the top links that come up in Google and doing like, full literature review before I talk about something. So I feel confident that I'm talking with some degree of, confidence. What do you think, Jessica, is the future of writing articles? And maybe we can talk a little bit about the curriculum and some additional supplemental articles that we're considering writing for the core curriculum.
Yeah. I do think that there's going to be like two categories of articles floating around out there where it's kind of sometimes obvious if it's like an AI like written article, because it's going to give you the straight facts, and it's going to like, so if you're writing an article on I don't know, the query selector, method, and it will give you the straight facts and be like, here's the basic syntax, here's a basic example, but there's not really a lot there unless you keep trying to prompt it to give you more. And so I think that people that it will invest in their writing skills and have their own voice will actually stand out more from these AI generated articles, because the AI generated, it's mostly going to be correct, but it's not really going to have a unique voice. It's just going to be a very dry, like straight to the point, here's your information, and it's just getting stuff from what they find from like documentation. But as a writer, you can inject your own style, your own voice into it, your own examples. Like one of the things I love to do is I like building out my own code examples and throwing it on CodePen and sharing it with people to like help teach a concept. And like AI is not going to do all that for you. Like they can whip up some code and you have to like, test it out yourself, but they're not going to like shape it into where it's more of like a narrative there. They're just going to give you like the dry facts. And so there's going to be kind of a difference between like AI generated articles versus those that are written by experienced technical writers that have their own voice, they have their own style. And so it's actually going to benefit those that want to build out their technical writing and kind of build out their content and following there, because they'll be able to stand out a little bit more for all the right reasons. So I think it's actually going to be a benefit there, and I think people will still be able to rank pretty high if they're writing technical articles regularly, and they'll still be able to compete with the other AI generated content that's going to inevitably just come out within the next few years there.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see like how it improves, but ChatGPT, like GPT-4 model is trained on more than 10,000 FreeCodeCamp articles. It's also trained on probably millions of Stack Overflow responses, all this stuff, right? Like one way to look at it is like it is the largest, most prolific, most powerful plagiarism engine ever. And I say plagiarism engine because it doesn't necessarily even remember where it read the stuff, but it's kind of like a human. Like obviously when I'm writing a tutorial, at some point I had to figure something out, and that might have involved me reading some thread on Stack Overflow or reading an exchange on the FreeCodeCamp forum, and I don't remember that I read that. Like it's just in there somewhere, right? Kind of like if you're playing some sort of musical piece, you might inadvertently kind of like quote or use some style of some other musician that you've listened to a lot of music from them. That's just how the human brain works, and it turns out that's kind of how neural networks work within these LLMs. Is they don't necessarily know how they know something, they just predict the next token, which just the next sequence of tokens just happens to sound a whole lot like something Jessica might have written in one of her CSS tutorials or something, right?
Right. Yeah. And so it's going to be interesting how the landscape is going to change over the next few years. But because people are always worried, like, oh, I'm just going to be replaced. I was like, if you really learn your craft and just dig in, especially learn deeper, because a lot of people are like, oh, it's too saturated. And my response is like, it's not as saturated as you think. Like, yes, earlier on, there is going to be a lot more competition, especially for obviously the junior level jobs. But if you really dig deeper and really learn those core skills really well, you're going to be able to stand out, because a lot of people aren't going to dig that deep. They're going to say, okay, I kind of have a surface level knowledge of like HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and yeah, that's cool. And they're not really going to push themselves to keep learning more and building more ambitious projects. And that's a way that you can stand out. It's the same thing with writing there, where you can really build out your own unique voice and kind of find a niche area that you want to write about, and still be able to get noticed there.
Yeah. And I'll just add that like even software engineers that are really at the top of their game, a guest who I've already recorded, but is going to be on an episode in a few weeks. Logan Kilpatrick worked, Julia Lang on the board of NumFocus, which runs like Pandas and a lot of other popular Python projects. He got a job at OpenAI, their first ever developer advocate, and he said he applied to hundreds of jobs, right, before he got the job that he wanted. And so just know that it's intrinsically hard to get a job as a developer. Employers have every incentive to be incredibly selective, because if they make a mistake, if they bring on the wrong person, that person can do so much damage within a code base, introducing security flaws, introducing all kinds of like just downtime potentially. Like they could crash a server or something like that, or they could, you can just imagine all the nightmare scenarios that they accidentally wiped some production, database or something like that, right? They're entrusted with a great deal of power. And also, developers are expensive. You bring on a developer, you spend all this time and energy training them. It takes approximately 6 months to get up to speed to where you're actually a net positive on a team. And what if they hired the wrong person? That's 6 months that they can't get back. It's a whole bunch of money they spent training you that they can't get back. And now they need to go do the whole search again and find somebody else for your position. And so there are a lot of reasons why it's hard to get a job as a developer. And they're not just because it's an extremely competitive field like music, right? Like if you're a musician and suddenly you just stop showing up to your job, they can probably replace you. But they probably haven't incurred as much damage as, like a giant tech company would have incurred, giving you all that access and having you potentially, like, I'm trying to think of like, and I keep it on music because we've spent so much time talking about that today. Let's say hypothetically, I'm hired as the bass player for a funk band, which would be, my dream come true. And I just completely sleep in, or I take the job. Like I'm really serious when I'm interviewing, and then like I take everything for granted, and I start thinking I'm like hot stuff. And people are like, "Why do we hire this guy again?" They're just gonna kick me out. I'm gonna be on the street, and they're gonna have a new bass player auditioning pretty quickly, right? It's not like that when you're a startup and you've got like tech. You've got like all these additional considerations. So I think that as competitive as music is, it's probably much easier to like lose your job in music than it is as a software developer at like a big tech company, because there are so many different considerations and meetings. They have to do all these interventions. They've got like all these protections for like an employee and stuff like that. So all I'm trying to do here is not like necessarily like excuse the fact that it's so difficult to get a job as a developer, but to kind of give you some context from the employer's perspective as to why it's so hard to bring people on. freeCodeCamp is a great example. Like we are extremely slow to bring people on, and we've never had to lay anybody off because we're super duper careful about managing like whom we bring on. And the way that we bring people on is precisely how we brought Jessica on. And that is to look for people who are already star volunteer contributors within the freeCodeCamp community, who are already active in the open source project, who are already active helping people on the forum, who are potentially writing articles about subjects they're interested in, and then say, hey, if we were to give you the funds to be able to do this full time. Would you be interested in doing that? Right. And so that's kind of how we bring people on. And as a result, we grow very slowly, but we grow very deliberately. It's a big difference from like a tech company that just, got raised their Series B and they have like $100 million to go out and hire a bunch of devs. They're still going to be pretty careful, but it's just like the kind of like hiring slow versus they may feel obligated to show their investors that they're quickly bringing people on. And that might create kind of the boom bust cycle that you see at a lot of tech companies, spending a great deal of time and energy hiring people and then unceremoniously laying those people off on big Zoom calls or something like that 6 months later. So I guess the whole reason I'm talking about this is just to give you additional context, and maybe I'm not saying like you should feel empathy for these giant corporations, but it will help you maintain your sanity as you're applying to jobs if you can at least kind of see things from their perspective. As irresponsible as a lot of these companies may seem, that's kind of the incentives they're responding to. People respond to incentives, and if their incentive is to bring a whole bunch of people on so they can reassure their investors that they're putting the funds that they just raised to good use and they're making forward momentum toward their projected earnings and stuff like that. Those are different incentives than if they're a small charity like freeCodeCamp that we're just going to wait for the perfect person, the perfect Jessica Wilkins to come along, and then we're going to bring her on and we're going to nurture her talent, right? So I'd love to talk a little bit in closing about the curriculum. You've been instrumental in helping develop the updated JavaScript interactive curriculum. If you go to freeCodeCamp.org/learn, you can see and you can play essentially the interactive, you can learn basic JavaScript by building a role-playing game. What are some of the other projects that are in the updated JavaScript curriculum?
Yeah, so we have a total of 21, and most of those are what are we considering like practice projects, and so that's where we lead you step by step. So the first one is the role-playing game. We're going to start with some basic HTML, some basic CSS, and then we dive straight into JavaScript, and we learn the basics about working with loops and variables and conditions and all that fun stuff, and we learn all that by building step by step a role-playing game. Then we move into a calorie counter project. So this is the first time you're actually going to work with user input. How do you validate that user input? And then we move to a music player project featuring your music. And so it's kind of a cool project there where you can play and pause and shuffle songs, remove songs, all of that fun stuff. And then we have a few of the other ones are a platformer game, a date formatter, a minimal reproduction of the forum leaderboard. So those are just a few of the things that you'll build, and each project is supposed to focus on a specific concept or a series of concepts. And so for the platformer game, you're going to be learning about object-oriented programming. We also have a shopping cart project that does the same thing. And then we also teach asynchronous JavaScript. And so we have you build out an authors page. We have you build out a forum leaderboard. And so each project is meant to teach you or help you review certain concepts. And we spent a lot of time building this out. It was great to release it in December of last year and work through the feedback there. But I think a lot of people like the more engaging step-by-step, because they can now put the pieces together and say, oh, okay, that's why we use objects and arrays and all of these different methods. Because I think before it was a series of challenges, but then people were like, how do I build a web page? And so we built out this new curriculum where you could build out these projects with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and put all of those pieces together. And so we're going to keep just working on it and making it even better based on the feedback that we get.
Yeah, and what's the mechanism through which we get the feedback? Like, how do you generally hear feedback from the community, learners who are going through these campers, as we call them, going through the JavaScript curriculum?
Yeah, so I'm super, super active on the forum. I'm a little bit less active on the Discord. I still kind of hop in there and peek around, but I'm not as active in the Discord community. And then I'm even less active on the Reddit community. But I think by far probably the biggest ones would be Reddit or be Discord and forum. And so I just go through the JavaScript. We have a little JavaScript subforum on there, and I go through and I help answer people's questions and talk with them. And I want to get a sense of like, okay, what what are they struggling with? What do they like? What do they not like? And so if a question keeps popping up and I'm like, okay, why are people, is there a theme here? Is maybe the directions might be not as clear, or maybe we need to add a code example, or maybe we just need to rephrase it, or maybe there's been times where we've broken up a step into two because it was just too much for them. And so I'm just going through, God knows how many posts at this point a week, and just like going through and seeing like what are people getting tripped up on. And if I see a theme, then I'll go ahead and create an issue. And most of the time we'll open up issues for the community to contribute to. So if I feel like it's a really small issue, I try to create as many first timers only issues, because a lot of people want to get started contributing to open source, but they're really intimidated. And so I try to create nice beginner friendly issues where I'll say, okay, this needs to be changed. Here's the file you need to change. Here's our contributing guide. And I give them a roadmap, and they're like, okay, cool. This is something that I can contribute to. It's less intimidating. And then we also have help wanted issues where it's like, we need to update these tests, or we need to do this, or add a new step or whatever. And it's less hand-holdy. That way they can still just get the basic information, just run with it. But I try to open up as many things as possible for contribution, because so many people want to get involved, and they want to find those good issues. And then for the larger issues where it's like, oh, we're changing a whole bunch of steps, that's where the team will step in and be like, all right, I'll take that on. And so that's what I've been working on the past few weeks, some of the bigger changes that we're doing, and just updating things. It's better to have a team member that's more familiar with the code base, because if we're going to start adding and removing a whole bunch of steps, then we don't want to obviously regress to the point where it's like, okay, this thing doesn't work. And so it's better to have somebody that's really familiar with the code base.
And that's definitely something it took us a long time to learn and appreciate. It may sound obvious, like, well, for like complicated changes, you don't necessarily want just any open source contributor, well-meaning, who can spend time scrutinizing code and potentially open a pull request. And we accept tons of pull requests from the community. But there does become a threshold when your legacy code base is so, baroque that like complicated, right? Ornate. What's a better word? I was just thinking baroque because we were talking about Mozart earlier. But like, where it's Byzantine, that has a negative connotation too. Where it's complicated enough, I'll just use the basic.
Right. Yeah.
The code base is complicated enough that a lot of people don't have the level of expertise where they can change things in all the different places to get that to work. So with open source, you do want to have a core team that's focused on the problems, and ideally, paid staff who are paid to sit around and think about these problems and think about how the curriculum can be improved. And at this point, I'd say like about half of the work at freeCodeCamp is done by the small core paid staff, and about half of it is done by the open source community and volunteer contributors creating articles and answering questions on the forum and potentially contributing to the curriculum itself. So that took a while for us to wrap our head around. Like, the reason a lot of open source projects don't really go anywhere is because they are never able to like bring on an actual staff to help drive it forward. And when you have volunteer contributors, they have to be extremely galvanized and motivated to actually be able to have like dramatic step change impact on what your project is doing. Usually you're going to have like a founder or some other people that are like super motivated, or at least getting paid something so they can be able to focus on expanding these resources. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't be shy if you are you shouldn't expect open source software to just work and for like the ecosystem to just naturally progress different projects. Like, you are going to need to have people who do nothing but like eat, sleep, and breathe that project to continue to push it forward. And there will be incremental, improvements that come from the open source community, and then there will be like dramatic improvements that come from a deliberative process by a team of software engineers and, in our case, teachers. So, if people want to get involved as volunteer contributors, what are probably the most immediate ways, in your opinion, having risen up as a volunteer contributor initially?
Yeah, I think for any open source project, but especially with Free Code Camp, is to join our Discord or forum. And so just joining in the community so you can get some more context of like what we're trying to do, what kind of issues are available, talk with other volunteer contributors. That's a great place to start. And both of those are free. You don't have to like pay for anything like that. And so you can just sign up real quick and start to join in and talk with the community, and then just start monitoring the issue boards. And so because we released a whole bunch of curriculums, not just the JavaScript one, but the Python one and the English one, we are constantly just going through auditing things and creating new issues. And so be on the lookout for first-timer only issues. Those are going to be really small. They're going to give you essentially the answer and changes that we want. And that way you'll be able to ramp up and start to run things locally or on Gitpod if that's an option that you want to explore as well. And then if you want to look for other issues, just reach out on Discord and say, hey, I want to keep contributing, but I'm not really sure. Like, I'm still a beginner. I'm still new to this. And people will reach out back on the forum and Discord and be like, oh, pick up this help wanted issue, or pick up this, or pick up that. And so if you're not really sure where to go next, people will help direct you, and they will literally link to you and so we don't assign issues. But we only assign it to like core contributors that have been there for years, or team members. But if you're interested in a help wanted issue, then you can just pick it up and read through the issue and whip up a pull request, and we'll review it there.
Yeah, and a lot of work goes into getting these issues ready for just any developer or even like aspiring developer to walk in and see this and be able to understand the problem. And so we do our best to kind of tee those up so that you can get an easy win by like, especially if you see like the first timers only label on some of the GitHub issues. That means we know how to fix this, but we want you to figure out how to fix it so you can get practice at this. And there's so many reasons to get involved in open source, because in my humble opinion, working as a reasonably large distributed team, freeCodeCamp's got 30 plus people working on the code base. It's the closest thing you can do to working at like a large company that has like a large legacy code base. Like Google has billions of lines of code, or it's at least 2 billion lines, I think, in a giant repo. They have their own version control system because it's so complicated. They don't use Git. But like open source, if you look at freeCodeCamp, it's a pretty complicated project. There's a lot of moving parts, and you can get practice at like wrapping your head around the different parts by contributing to open source. You can contribute to lots of other big open source projects like the Python libraries. You can even user-facing projects like, for example, Firefox or some different Linux distributions or things like that, right? Contributing to open source is one of the best ways to get practical, real-world experience outside of working in an internship capacity or working at an actual employer, which means that, it's going to be a great simulation. It's going to be a great experience. And a good hiring manager is going to realize the value of open source contributions, and that it's not, just nobody snaps their fingers and has like a really active GitHub with like all these projects they've contributed to. They have to rise to a certain level of quality to have their work accepted. So, I would encourage people who are thinking about getting into tech, like, definitely don't sleep on open source contributions. It can be a great way to work with a lot of other developers, communicate, and build out those skills. I want to make sure that I want to be mindful of your time. You've given us so much of your time, Jessica. But like, were there any other parting thoughts or messages you have to people who are listening, who are getting into tech and potentially wanting to follow in your footsteps, get a job as a software engineer, potentially have freelance clients, potentially build a project like the Black Excellence Project, or potentially start a small business like you've done that has just continued to chug along over the years?
Yeah, I guess like my parting words there would be like to make sure to join a community. I think one of the biggest mistakes that new developers make is they try to do this by themselves. And if you're going down the self-taught route, especially, like, you don't need to figure everything out by yourself. Like, you're brand new to this, you don't know what you don't know yet, and you don't need to try to figure everything out alone. There's other people that have walked literally ahead of you that are going to be like, oh, hey, be careful about this pitfall, or, oh, I tried this and this didn't work. And so when you are part of a community, you get to learn from other people that are, a year ahead of you or 2 years or 20 years ahead of you. And so when it comes time to learning, like, we got a lot of people that join the forum and they're like, I'm brand new, where do I start? Or am I too old to start learning how to code? Or could people, give me feedback on my resumes and stuff like that? And so when you join a community, people will jump in and give you help, and they'll provide their insights on their journeys. And it's going to be probably pretty similar to yours, the self-taught journey. And so, like, just don't try to think like, I'm just going to put my headphones on and just, learn to code by myself. Go talk to other people, because they're going to have like stories and they'll be able to help you, especially when it comes to jobs. One of the huge helps was that when I started joining different communities where people were talking about, I remember there's one community I was or one company I was interested in, and a few people, I mentioned it in a Discord, and they're like, oh my gosh, don't work there, it's so toxic. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I never would have known that unless people like told me about this, and I was like, I was about to totally apply and go down that route. And this was a few years ago, and like I had just no clue. And so they're like, oh, stay away from these types of companies, and you really look into these companies. And so you just want to have people around you to help you. And too, like, a lot of people want to stay, like, they ask like, how can I stay motivated? And my thing is like, motivation will come and go. It's not going to be this like constant motivation thing, and a lot of people are kind of surprised by that when they go through this journey. But I think just building the discipline of, I'm just going to do a little bit each day, and you don't have to knock it out of the park each day. I think a lot of new people think like, oh, okay, I'm going to learn HTML and then I'm going to learn CSS, and then it's just going to be this easy road. There are going to be times where you end the day and you're like, I don't think I understood what the reduce method does. I don't think I understood what recursion is today. And that's totally fine. Like, people think that's like a bad thing, but it's like, there's some concepts that just take longer to understand. And so just kind of give yourself some grace there, and just keep taking it just one small step at a time.
Just to riff a little bit on what you said, because I mean, there's so many great portable things there that we'll try putting some of those in the thumbnail for the video. You don't have to do this alone. Motivation will come and go. I'm just going to do a little bit each day. To answer the question that so many people ask, probably one of the most common questions I get: am I too old to learn to code? It's 2 letters. It's no. I learned when I was like 30, 31. I know people that learned to code in their 50s and got jobs at big tech companies like Apple and stuff. It's definitely doable. And as long as you think you have like another 10 or 20 years of career left in you, it probably makes sense to start learning coding. Worst case scenario, you'll be able to pivot into kind of like a semi-technical role. Coding knowledge, understanding how machines work, understanding how organizations work, like the hive mind of developers that builds up a code base, that is never bad knowledge to have on hand. In fact, I'd argue that there is no knowledge that is not power. That's the Mortal Kombat 3, arcade mode thing. I totally agree that like you should definitely learn it, and don't let age intimidate you. And thank you again so much for your time, for sharing your lived experience, for sharing what it's like to become a professional musician. So hard, right? I mean, so
it was
much
a journey.
Yeah. And then to leave that, once you're getting the calls from Disney, and then to just leave that behind, it takes some serious audacity. But, it's the hill climbing algorithm. You get to the top of a hill, you look over, you see a higher hill. Human nature, I don't want to climb all the way down this hill just to climb up another taller hill. But you don't have to immediately, but you can look in the mirror and every day, am I ready to start going down this hill and climbing up the other hill, right? And climbing down and up is not really, it can feel like that, but in reality, you're probably, you can keep your day job, as they say, right? You didn't shut down the sheet music business. You didn't immediately turn away all your students and all your gigs and stuff. You just started learning on the side, and that's a very pragmatic way to do it. So thank you so much for your time, Jessica. It's a privilege and an honor to work alongside a creative, like thoughtful teacher like yourself, software engineer like yourself. And thank you.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thanks for having me.
Everybody tuning in, Until next week, happy coding.